The bright lights in the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse made sharp. Dark lines on the witness stand on March 2nd, 1992. People in the seats, especially the writers for the newspapers, leaned in close. They held their pens ready, knowing they were going to see something very important. The feeling in the room was strong and heavy, like something big that had been hidden for a very long time was finally going to come out. Before we start this amazing true tale that goes through many years of control, friendship, and a huge act of disloyalty, tell me where you are right now and what the clock says. This tale is just right for listening to late at night. It is a story to let fill your mind as everything else gets quiet. If you are getting comfortable to go on this trip with me, please press that like button. Send this to a friend who likes real tales about real folks. And be sure you are signed up, because we are going to be together for the next few hours, learning about one of the most interesting and complicated people in the history of crime in America. Now, let us return to March 2nd, 1992. Salvatore, who everyone called Sammy the Bull, Gravano fixed his tie and cleared his throat. On the other side of the room, sitting at the table for the defense with his perfect hair and very expensive suit, was John Gotti. This was the man who used to be his leader, his pal, his brother in the most brutal family America had ever known. The eyes of the man they called the Dapper Don were filled with a hot anger that could have made metal melt. But Sammy did not look away. This was the moment that would break the old rule of omerta. That was the special promise of quiet that had kept the American Mafia safe for almost 100 years. When Sammy started to talk, he would not just be speaking against John Gotti. He would be opening a door to a world that worked in darkness, telling secrets that men had killed for, died for, and lived their whole lives to keep safe. The first question from the government lawyer cut through the quiet like a knife. Mr. Gravano, what was your job in the Gambino crime family? Sammy's voice was calm, almost like he was just talking about regular things, not like he was taking apart a huge, powerful group. I was the underboss, under John Gotti, and with those 9 words, everything was different from that moment on. But to really know how we got to this moment, this biggest act of disloyalty that would shake the criminal world and change American organized crime forever, we need to start at the start. We need to go back to the streets of Brooklyn, where a little boy named Salvatore Gravano first learned that in his area, respect was not something people gave you. You had to take it. The year was 1945, and America was happy because it had won a war that changed the whole world. But in the tight streets of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a different kind of war was always being fought. In this war, land was measured by city blocks. Respect was like money, and hurting people was just another way to do business. Salvatore Gravano came into the world on March 12, 1945. He was born into this place where the line between good and bad was not drawn by law books or what teachers said was right, but by neighborhood rules. Those rules had been taught through many generations of people who came from other countries. They had learned that sometimes, to stay alive, you had to make your own fair treatment. His mother and father, Gerlando and Caterina Gravano, had come to America with the same hope that millions before them had, the idea that working hard could make a better life. Gerlando worked painting houses. His hands were always stained with the colors of other people's dreams. Caterina took care of their small apartment and raised their kids with a strong protectiveness that only a mother in a tough neighborhood could know. The Gravano family lived in a simple 2-story house on 86th Street, right in the middle of what people there called the neighborhood. This was not just any part of Brooklyn. This was Bensonhurst, where the old ways still meant something. where your word was a solid promise, and where being disrespectful could make you lose everything you had. From his earliest memories, Sammy was not like the other children. While the kids in his class played stickball and traded baseball cards, he was watching the grown-ups around him. He saw how they walked, how they talked, how they got people to respect them. Even as a little boy, he knew that respect was the most important thing in his world. It was better than money, and stronger than any weapon. The neighborhood was full of families who worked regular jobs. Many of them were Italian families who had come from other countries. They brought with them their traditions and their food, but also their understanding of how the world really worked. They knew that sometimes the police could not help you. They knew that sometimes the courts did not give people what was fair. They knew that sometimes a man had to fix his own problems. Young Sammy soaked up these lessons like a sponge takes in water. He watched as certain men walked through the neighborhood like they were kings. He saw how people stopped talking when they came near. He saw how even the toughest guys on the block showed them respect. These were not men who worked with their hands. Like his father, these were men who worked with their minds, their connections, their ability to solve problems that other people could not fix. The Gravano house was always full of the sounds and smells from Italy. Caterina would spend many hours in the kitchen getting ready for the big Sunday meals. These meals brought the whole family together around a table where grown-up business was talked about in low voices. The children were told to eat and to listen, but never to repeat what they heard. It was at these Sunday dinners that Sammy first started to understand the complicated web of connections that ran his world. Uncle Sal was not really his uncle, but he was like family in a way that was deeper than just blood. Cousin Tony knew people who could help with problems at work. And when someone had trouble with a neighbor or a business fight that the courts could not fix, certain phone calls could be made. Certain favors could be asked. Sammy was a smart boy. But school did not interest him much. The nuns at his Catholic school tried to teach him about right and wrong, about following rules and respecting people in charge. But the lessons he learned on the street were different. They were more useful, more about the real world he saw all around him. He was small for his age, but he was strong and solid, with dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. The other children sometimes thought his size meant he was weak, but they learned they were wrong very fast. Sammy did not just fight back when someone bothered him. He fought with a fierceness that shocked the grown-ups and gave him a name that followed him all through his school years. His parents worried about their son's anger, his quick move to fighting when he felt someone was disrespectful. They had come to America to get away from the old ways, the cycles of revenge and violence that had hurt their home country for hundreds of years. But they were fighting against something stronger than just what they wanted. They were fighting against the neighborhood itself. The neighborhood seemed to call to boys like Sammy with promises of respect, power, and belonging. By the time Sammy was 10 years old, he had already been in many, many fights. These were not just little playground arguments. They were real fights where people bled and where you made a name for yourself. He did not start these fights looking for trouble, but trouble found him very often. If someone insulted him, if someone said something disrespectful, if someone challenged his name, these were all reasons to fight that Sammy never said no to. His father, Gerlando, tried to turn his son's fighting into something better. He taught him how to box in the basement of their house. He hoped that fighting with rules might satisfy the boy's need for a physical fight. But boxing had too many rules for Sammy's personality. He liked the mess of a street fight, where anything could happen and the only rule was to win. The neighborhood kids began to follow Sammy around. They were drawn by his reputation and his natural way of being a leader. He was not the biggest kid or the strongest, but he had something more valuable. He had a presence. When Sammy talked, people listened. When he made a choice, people followed. When he said something was going to happen, it happened. These early times as a leader were Sammy's first taste of power, and he found that he liked it. He liked having other kids look up to him, depend on him, and be a little bit afraid of him, just enough to take him seriously. He began to understand that power was not just about being strong, it was about your reputation. It was about the stories people told about you when you were not there. The Gravano family went to church every Sunday at Regina Passes Catholic Church. Young Sammy would sit in the wooden benches and listen to Father Dangilo talk about being saved and being damned, about choosing between good and evil. But the lessons that stuck with him were not about God's judgment or what happens after you die. They were about loyalty, about family, about the bonds that tied people together in ways that were stronger than any law. As Sammy became a teenager, the space between him and his parents started to grow. They wanted him to think about school, to think about college, to think about a real job that would lift him out of the neighborhood and into the regular American dream. But Sammy was already dreaming different dreams. His dreams were shaped by different people he looked up to. He had started to notice the men who drove the fancy cars, who wore suits made just for them, who got respect not from a job title, but from their own personal power. These men did not have bosses. They made their own rules, fixed their own problems, and lived by a code that was older and stronger than any law. The change from Salvatore, the house painter's son, to Sammy the Bull Gravano, the future underboss of the Gambino crime family, did not happen in one day. It was a slow process, like water slowly carving a canyon through solid rock. Every fight, every time he showed loyalty, every time he showed he was willing to use violence for a principle, each thing carved him deeper into the person he would become. By his 16th birthday, Sammy had been kicked out of school many times, arrested twice for fighting, and had a reputation that went far past his own neighborhood. He was not just Gerlando's boy or Caterina's son anymore. He was becoming someone on his own, someone whose name had weight on the streets of Brooklyn. The path was set, though no one fully knew it yet. The boy who had been born into the American dream was picking a different road, a road that went deeper into the shadows of his neighborhood, into a world where loyalty was everything, where violence was normal, and where the only boss that mattered was the respect you could get from your own actions. The summer of 1961 was especially hot and hard in Brooklyn. The heat rose from the sidewalk like steam, and people's tempers were short in the crowded apartment buildings and narrow streets of Bensonhurst. For 16-year-old Sammy Gravano, it was the summer he would later remember as when his real schooling began. Not the kind in classrooms, but the kind you can only learn with bruised hands and a cut lip. Sammy had left school that spring, which made his parents very sad. The nuns had finally given up on him after too many problems. And honestly, he was happy to be free of their rules and what they expected. The streets offered a different kind of learning, one that seemed much more useful to the life he was already living. His days started early, usually with a visit to Tylai's restaurant on 86th Street. This was where the neighborhood's young tough guys would meet over coffee and Italian pastries to plan their day. Tylai's was not just a restaurant, it was an important place, where information was shared, friendships were made, and reputations were built or broken with a few careful words. The owner, Salvatore Testa, everyone called him Uncle Sal, though he was not related to most of his customers, had a talent for making everyone feel like family all knowing everything that happened in the neighborhood. He knew which kids were heading for trouble, which ones might do something with their lives, and which ones could become real players in the life. Uncle Sal had been watching Sammy Gravano for months, and he liked what he saw. The kid had courage. No question. More important, he had brains. While other teenage tough guys only used muscle and threats, Sammy thought about strategy. He understood that every action had a result, and he was always thinking several steps ahead. It was at Tyli's that Sammy first met Tommy Gotti, a kid from the neighborhood who was a few years older. Tommy had already made a name for himself as someone you did not want to make angry. Tommy was big and mean, with huge hands and a temper that could explode for no reason. But he saw something in Sammy that made him show respect, a mix of fearlessness and intelligence that was rare in their world. The two became best friends, forming a team that would affect both their lives for many years to come. Tommy had the muscle, while Sammy had the brains. Together, they started doing jobs that other kids would not touch. They collected money for local bookies, gave protection to neighborhood businesses, and settled arguments that could not be fixed the normal way. Their first real score came that summer. A man named Joey Marino, who ran numbers for a crew from Bay Ridge, tried to start his business in Bensonhurst without showing the right respect to the local players. The bookies who were all ready, they were very angry, but they needed someone to send a message without getting their own hands dirty. The job came through Uncle Sal, who called Sammy and Tommy to a private meeting in the back room of his restaurant. The room was small with no windows, smelling of garlic and cigarette smoke. With one table and 3 chairs, Uncle Sal got right to the point. "This Marino thinks he can come into our neighborhood and set up shop without paying his dues," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that showed the scars of his own violent youth. "The guys who've been running the numbers here for 20 years are not happy. They need this problem to go away." Sammy understood right away what was being asked. This was not about killing Joey Marino. That would bring too much heat and attention. This was about sending a message that would be heard all over Brooklyn. Bensonhurst was not open land. Anyone who wanted to do business there had better show respect. "What kind of message are we talking about?" Sammy asked. His voice was calm and professional. Even though he was young, Uncle Sal smiled. This was why he liked the kid. No drama, no tough guy act, just straight business. The kind that puts him in the hospital for a few weeks and convinces him that Bay Ridge is a beautiful place to do business. The payment was $500 more money than Sammy had ever seen at one time, split between him and Tommy. It meant freedom from the part-time construction jobs and grocery store work that other kids their age did. More importantly, it meant being accepted into a world where real money could be made by men who were willing to take real risks. They found Joey Marino 3 days later. He was collecting money from one of his numbers runners outside a barbershop on 20th Avenue. Sammy had watched his target for 2 days. He learned his routines, found his weak spots, and planned the best way to do it while keeping themselves safe. Tommy wanted to just walk up and beat the guy badly, but Sammy had a smarter plan. They waited until Marino was alone, walking to his car after dark, carrying a paper bag that probably had the day's money in it. Sammy came at him from the front, while Tommy came from behind. "Joey Marino," Sammy's voice was polite, almost friendly. When the older man turned around, Sammy hit him with a right punch that broke his nose and sent him stumbling back into Tommy's waiting arms. What happened next was quick, professional, and terrible. They did not beat him randomly or lose control. They broke specific bones: his right arm, his left leg, 3 ribs, These were injuries that would keep him from working for months. They would also be a clear reminder of what happens to people who do not show the right respect. But the most important part came at the end, when Marino was lying on the sidewalk, bleeding and broken, but still awake. Sammy knelt down beside him and spoke in a voice that was almost kind. "Brooklyn's a big place, Joey. Bay Ridge has plenty of chances for a guy who knows how to show respect. Bensonhurst is not your neighborhood. Do we understand each other?" Marino nodded, blood coming from his nose. He understood perfectly. The job was a perfect piece of controlled violence. Word of it spread fast through the neighborhood's secret networks. Sammy Gravano, the house painter's son, had handled himself like a professional. More importantly, he had shown that he could be trusted with serious business. Over the next few months, more jobs came their way. A restaurant owner who was having trouble with protection rackets from another area. A small-time loan shark who was being pushed around by people he owed. A numbers runner who had decided to steal from his collections and needed to be reminded why honesty is important in business. Each job taught Sammy something new about the world he was entering. He learned about the complicated levels that ran criminal businesses, the unwritten rules that decided who could work where, and the careful balance of fear and respect that kept the whole system working. He also learned about violence, not just how to use it, but how to control it, how to use it as a tool, not as the main goal. Sammy knew in his gut that random violence was for amateurs. Professional violence was exact, had a purpose, and always served a bigger plan. By the winter of 1961, Sammy's reputation had grown so much that the important people in the neighborhood were starting to notice him. He was not just another tough kid looking for action anymore. He was becoming a young man with real potential in the life. You could see the change in everything about him. Gone were the t-shirts and jeans from school. Now he wore pressed pants and button-down shirts. The way he carried himself was different. Too, there was a confidence, a sense of purpose that made people pay attention and show respect. His relationship with his parents became more difficult during this time. They could see the changes in their son. They could feel he was moving away from them and towards something they did not understand and could not control. The talks around the family dinner table became shorter and more tense, filled with unspoken blame and disappointed hopes. Gerlando tried one last time to reach his son. He offered to help him start his own painting business, to teach him a real trade that could make a decent living. But Sammy had tasted something no real job could give him, the exciting mix of respect, power, and the chance to make unlimited money that came with life in the neighborhood's shadowy economy. "This isn't what we came to America for," his father said one night, his voice heavy with the weight of broken dreams. "We came here so our children could have better lives. Real lives." Sammy looked at his father with something that might have been pity. "Pop, you've been in America for 20 years, and you're still painting other people's houses. I've been in business for 6 months, and I'm making more in a week than you make in a month. Maybe you need to think about what better really means." It was a cruel thing to say to a man who had worked his whole life to take care of his family. But it showed Sammy's growing belief that the normal path school, a real job, moving up slowly through regular companies, was for fools. The real money, the real power, the real respect were there for men who were willing to make their own rules and make people follow them with their own strength. As 1961 came to a close, 17-year-old Sammy Gravano had finished his basic schooling in the arts of intimidation, violence, and criminal business, but he was still small-time, still limited to neighborhood-level jobs that, while good money for a teenager, meant nothing in the bigger world of organized crime It controlled much of Brooklyn's illegal money. That was about to change. Word had reached certain important people about the house painter's son who handled himself like a pro and could be trusted to keep quiet. These were people who controlled much bigger operations. They thought about areas, not street corners. They measured success not in hundreds of dollars, but in hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were about to offer Sammy Gravano a chance that would change his life forever, a chance to join a real crew, to learn from men who had made fortunes in the shadowy world of organized crime, and to start climbing the ladder of what would one day be called America's most powerful crime family. The boy was about to become a man, and the man was about to become something much more dangerous. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in February 1962. While Sammy was having breakfast at Talai's restaurant, Uncle Sal came to his table with a look Sammy had learned to recognize. It was the look of a man who had important business to talk about. "Finish your coffee and come to the back," Uncle Sal said quietly. "There's someone who wants to meet you in the back room." A man Sammy had never seen before sat smoking a cigarette and reading the newspaper. He was in his 40s, dressed well but not flashy, in a way that marked him as someone important in the neighborhood's order. When he looked up at Sammy, his eyes were the color of winter ice, and they seemed to notice everything about him in one look. "You're Gerlando's boy," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. I'm Toto Arello." He didn't need to say anything else. Everyone in Bensonhurst knew who Toto Arello was, a capo in the Gambino family. A man who controlled a big piece of Brooklyn's illegal money. Someone whose approval could make careers and whose anger could end them. Uncle Sal quietly left the room, leaving Sammy alone with one of the most powerful men he had ever met. Toto put out his cigarette and studied the 17-year-old for a long moment before speaking. "I've been hearing things about you," he said finally. "Good things. You handle yourself like a professional. You keep your mouth shut, and you understand that business is business. These are valuable qualities." Sammy waited. He knew in his gut that this was not a conversation where he should offer information or try to impress. Men like Toto didn't need to be impressed. They needed to be respected and listened to. "I'm putting together a crew," Toto continued. "Young guys with potential. Guys who can learn the right way to do things. There's money to be made, real money, but it requires discipline and total loyalty. You interested?" It was the chance Sammy had been getting ready for his whole life without even knowing it. Everything that had happened up to this point, the fights, the jobs, the slow building of his reputation, had led to this moment. He was being asked to enter the real world of organized crime, not as a street-level tough guy, but as a possible member of an established crew with connections all through the criminal underworld. "Yes, sir, I'm very interested," Toto nodded, looking pleased. "Good, but first, you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't kid stuff anymore. The men you'll be working with have killed people. Some of them have been to prison. All of them have sworn an oath that's more sacred than marriage, more binding than any legal contract. Once you're in for life. There's no retirement, no quitting, no walking away when things get tough." He paused to light another cigarette, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The rewards are big, more money than you've ever imagined. Respect all through the neighborhood, protection from your enemies, and the knowledge that you're part of something bigger than yourself. But the price is high. Everything you do reflects on the family. Every mistake you make becomes everyone's problem. And if you ever break the trust that's being placed in you, the results will be forever." Sammy understood. He was being offered membership in what was basically a secret society, with its own rules its own system of justice, and its own code of right and wrong that existed alongside and sometimes against the laws of regular society. "I understand," he said simply. "We'll see. Your first job is tonight. There's a problem that needs to be fixed, and I want to see how you handle yourself when things get serious." That evening, Sammy found himself in a car with 3 other men, driving through the dark streets of Queens toward an area of warehouses he had never seen before. The other men, Louis Melito, Joe Peruta, and Stevie D'Angelo, were all experienced members of Tato's crew. They treated Sammy with the casual lack of interest saved for new guys who hadn't proven themselves yet. The target was a man named Vincent Mazzara. He had been stealing from his numbers operation and lying about how much money he collected to Tato's people. Worse, when asked about the missing money, he had been disrespectful, saying maybe it was time for him to take his business somewhere else. In the world Sammy was entering, such behavior could not be allowed. It wasn't just about the money, though the missing cash was a lot. It was about respect. It was about keeping the discipline that made the whole criminal system work. If word got out that someone could steal from Tato Arello and go unpunished, it would make others try the same thing. They found Mazzara at a social club in Astoria, playing cards with friends. His friends scattered like cockroaches when Tato's crew walked through the door. Mazzara himself tried to act casual, as if this were just a normal visit from business friends. "Tato's boys," he said, with forced cheerfulness. "What brings you to my neighborhood?" Louis Melito, who seemed to be in charge of the job, got right to the point. "You know why we're here, Vinny. You've got something that belongs to Mr. Arello." "I don't know what you're talking about." $43,000. That's what you're short over the last 6 months. You think we don't keep books?" Mazzara's face went pale, but he tried to bluff his way through. "There must be some mistake. I've been running clean operations." "Never stole a dime." It was the wrong answer. Sammy watched as Louis's expression hardened, as Joe Peruta moved to block the exit, as the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was the moment when polite talk ended and serious business began. "Here's what's going to happen," Louis said, his voice calm and conversational. "You're going to come with us for a ride. We're going to have a more detailed talk about your bookkeeping, and you're going to help us understand exactly where that missing money went." Mazzara looked around the room, maybe hoping for help from his friends. But the place was completely empty. In situations like this, smart people made themselves scarce. He was on his own. "I'm not going anywhere with you guys," he said, trying to sound tough, but unable to keep the fear out of his voice. That's when Sammy got his first lesson in how Tato's crew handled people who didn't cooperate. Louis nodded almost invisibly to Stevie D'Angelo, who stepped forward and hit Mazzara with a short, vicious uppercut. The punch lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into a table of empty beer bottles. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo forever in the sudden quiet. Mazzara lay among the broken pieces, blood coming from his nose, looking up at men whose expressions hadn't changed at all. The violence had been quick, professional, and completely matter-of-fact. "Now," Louis said pleasantly, "let's try that again. You're going to come with us for a ride." They drove to an abandoned warehouse in an industrial part of Queens, a place where screams wouldn't be heard and where cleaning up would be easy. Sammy's heart was pounding, but he kept his face blank. He understood he was being tested just as much as Mazzara was being punished. Inside the warehouse, they tied Mazzara to a chair and began the kind of conversation that had been happening in similar places all over Brooklyn for many years. It started with questions about the missing money. Where had it gone? Why did Mazzara think he could steal from people who trusted him? When Mazzara kept saying he did nothing wrong, the conversation became more physical. Joe Paruta, who looked like someone's grandfather, proved to be an artist with a baseball bat. He broke bones with surgical precision, never letting the victim lose consciousness. Through it all, Sammy watched and learned. This wasn't random violence or cruel fun. This was business done with the same professional detachment a surgeon might have during an operation. Every hit served a purpose. Every question was part of a bigger plan to get information and set consequences for betrayal. After 2 hours, Mazzara finally broke. The money had gone to support a gambling habit that had gotten out of control. He had been betting on everything: horses, sports, card games, and losing. Instead of telling his bosses about his problem, he chose to steal from the collections, thinking he could replace the money before anyone noticed. It was a story they had all heard before. A familiar tale of weakness leading to betrayal, leading to results that could never be undone. Where's the money now? Louis asked. Gone, Mazzara sobbed. All of it? I owe bookies in 3 states, even if I had it. I couldn't pay you back. Louis looked at his partners, and Sammy saw something pass between them. A silent communication he didn't understand yet, but knew was important. Here's the thing, Vinny, Louis said, pulling up a chair so he was sitting right in front of the broken man. You didn't just steal from us. You lied to us. You disrespected us. And now you're telling us you can't make it right. That gives us a problem. Sammy realized with a chill down his spine that Vincent Mazzara was not going home that night. This had moved past punishment into something much more final. Please, Mazzara whispered. I got kids. I got a family. You should have thought about that before you decided to become a thief, Stevie said coldly. What happened next would stay with Sammy for the rest of his life. He watched as 3 men he was learning to respect and admire methodically ended another person's life. Not in anger or passion, but as a simple business decision. Vincent Mazzara had become a problem that could no longer be allowed, and he was being removed with the same efficiency that might be used to close down an unprofitable business. Louis was the one who actually pulled the trigger, using a .38 revolver he had carried in his coat pocket the whole evening. 2 shots to the head, quick and clean, and Vincent Mazzara's gambling problem was solved forever. In the quiet that followed, Sammy felt like he had crossed an invisible line. He had passed through a barrier that separated the world he had known from the world he was entering. He had seen his first murder. He hadn't done it himself, but he understood that being there made him part of it. It tied him to the men around him in ways that could never be undone. How you feeling, kid? Joe Paruta asked him as they wrapped Mazzara's body in plastic. Fine, Sammy replied, and he realized he meant it. The violence had been shocking, but not sickening. The death had been necessary, and he understood why. Vincent Mazzara had made choices that led to this moment, and now he was facing the results of those choices. They got rid of the body in a place Sammy was never told about, following procedures that had obviously been perfected through years of experience. By sunrise, there was no trace of Vincent Mazzara, except for the missing person report his family would file later that week. As they drove back to Brooklyn, Louis turned to Sammy with something that might have been approval in his expression. You did good tonight, kid. Kept your mouth shut. Didn't ask stupid questions. Didn't lose your nerve when things got serious. That's exactly what we're looking for. It was Sammy's first real compliment from an established member of Toto's crew. It meant more to him than any praise he had ever received from teachers, parents, or regular authority figures. These men had accepted him. They had brought him into their world. They had trusted him with their darkest secrets. He would give them his total loyalty, his complete silence, and his unwavering commitment to the principles that ruled their shared life. He would become one of them, learn their ways, adopt their values, and eventually do better than most of them in understanding how power really worked in their shadow world. The education of Sammy Gravano was entering its advanced level, and he was proving to be an excellent student. By the summer of 1963, Sammy Gravano had become a regular part of Toto Arello's crew. He was no longer the untested kid who had to prove himself with every job. Now he was a trusted associate whose opinion was asked for and whose judgment was respected. The change had been slow but clear. He carried himself differently, spoke with more authority, and commanded the kind of respect that can only be earned through proven skill and unshakable loyalty. Toto's crew worked out of a social club on 20th Avenue. It was a plain storefront with blacked-out windows and a door that was always locked to outsiders inside. The club was furnished with a kind of quiet elegance that marked it as a place where serious men discussed serious business. Leather chairs around card tables, a well-stocked bar, and walls decorated with pictures of neighborhood legends who had earned their place in local history through their contributions to the life. The club did many things. During the day, it was a meeting place where crew members would gather to get instructions, report on their activities, and coordinate their different businesses. In the evening, it became a social center where important people in the neighborhood could relax, enjoy each other's company, and do the kind of informal diplomacy that kept peace between competing groups. For Sammy, the club was like a university where he studied subjects not taught in any regular classroom. He learned about the complicated money side of illegal gambling, the delicate art of loan sharking, the details of stolen goods distribution, and the psychology of intimidation. More importantly, he learned about respect, how to earn it, how to keep it, and how to use it as both a weapon and a shield in a world where your reputation was often the difference between success and disaster. Toto Arello was a natural teacher, though his methods were far from regular teaching. He never lectured or explained theories. Instead, he showed principles through real use, letting his students watch, take part, and slowly soak up the wisdom that came from decades of successful criminal business. The key to this business, Toto told Sammy one afternoon as they sat in the club's back room going over the week's money, is understanding that we're not criminals. We're businessmen who work outside the law because the law doesn't serve our community's needs. It was a difference that would shape Sammy's thinking for the rest of his career. In Toto's view, they weren't breaking society's rules. They were following older, more basic rules that came before governments and police departments. They were providing services that people wanted, but couldn't get through regular channels. They were enforcing deals that the courts wouldn't recognize. They were keeping order in situations where regular authority was either absent or useless. The crew's main business was gambling, numbers running, sports betting, and card games that made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in pure profit. But Toto taught Sammy that successful criminal businesses, like successful real businesses, had many ways to make money, reinvested their profits, and always looked for new chances to grow. Loan sharking went naturally with gambling, since players who lost more than they could afford often needed quick loans to cover their debts or keep playing. Toto's crew offered loans at interest rates that would have been called criminal in any real context. But their collection methods made sure that people rarely failed to pay and that payment schedules were strictly followed. The crew also had interests in several real businesses: a construction company, a trucking firm, and a chain of restaurants. These provided both cover for their illegal activities and chances to clean dirty money. Sammy learned how clean money and dirty money could be mixed until you couldn't tell where they came from. He learned how real businesses could be used to explain fancy lifestyles, and how looking respectable could give protection from police attention. But the most important lesson Tato taught him was about violence, not just how to use it, but when to use it, how much to use, and most crucially, when not to use it at all. Violence is like medicine, Tato explained after a particularly brutal debt collection that left a man in the hospital with broken ribs and a punctured lung. The right amount at the right time can fix a problem. Too little, and the problem stays too much. And you create bigger problems than the one you started with. Sammy soaked up this wisdom through direct watching and hands-on experience. He learned that the threat of violence was often better than violence itself. He learned that a reputation for being ruthless could achieve what actual brutality might not. He learned that the most successful criminals were those who used force as part of a plan, not randomly. One of his most educational experiences came in the spring of 1964. A rival crew from Staten Island began trying to push into Tato's numbers operation in Bath Beach. The situation needed careful handling. Too strong a response might start a war, bringing unwanted attention from both police and higher levels of the Gambino family. But too weak a response would signal that Tato's area was open to more invasion. Tato put Sammy in charge of a small team to show the Staten Island crew that their expansion plans were not welcome. It was a big responsibility, a leadership chance that could either make Sammy's reputation in the organization or ruin it if he handled it poorly. So Sammy spent 2 weeks studying the situation. He learned about the people involved, their strengths and weaknesses, their connections in the broader criminal community, and how they would likely react to different kinds of pressure. He approached the problem like a chess master, thinking many moves ahead and preparing backup plans for every possible situation. The Staten Island crew was led by a man named Anthony Gaggi, who had a reputation for unpredictable violence and very little patience for talking. Gaggi's way of handling area disputes was simple: kill anyone in your way and let fear keep your boundaries. It was an effective plan in the short term, but it created enemies and brought attention that eventually led to problems. Instead of confronting Gaggi directly, Sammy chose to hit his operation at its weakest point: the network of street-level collectors who actually handled the day-to-day contact with bettors. These were neighborhood guys who worked for Gaggi, not out of loyalty or fear, but simply because he paid them better than their other choices. Sammy offered several of Gaggi's collectors much better deals to switch their loyalty to Tato's operation. Higher pay, better protection, and the security that came with working for an established crew with deep roots in the community. Within a week, half of Gaggi's collection network had switched sides, taking their customer lists with them. When Gaggi responded by sending enforcers to scare the defectors, Sammy was ready. The enforcers found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and facing opponents who knew the neighborhood better than they did. 2 of Gaggi's men ended up in the hospital. The third carried back a message that was both clear and polite. Bath Beach was not available for expansion, but Tato's crew was always interested in talking about business arrangements that would help everyone. The message was received and understood. Gaggi pulled his people from Brooklyn and focused on less well-defended areas. The crisis was solved without anyone being killed, without attracting police attention, and without creating the kind of feud that could have led to years of violence. Tato was impressed. "You handled that perfectly," he told Sammy after the situation was over. "You understood that the goal wasn't to hurt anybody or prove how tough we are, The goal was to protect our business interests while keeping the peace. That's the mark of a man who's ready for bigger responsibilities. Those bigger responsibilities came sooner than Sammy had expected. In the fall of 1964, Toto told him he was being considered for formal membership in the Gambino family, not just as an associate or crew member, but as a made man with all the rights, privileges, and duties that came with that status. The idea was both thrilling and sobering. Being a made member of a crime family was the highest recognition in their world. It was an acknowledgement that the person had the intelligence, loyalty, and proven skill to be trusted with the organization's most sensitive secrets. But it was also a lifetime promise that could never be taken back or abandoned. This isn't something you accept lightly, Toto warned him. Once you take the oath, there's no going back. Your loyalty to the family becomes absolutely more important than your loyalty to your wife, your children, or your own life. You'll be expected to kill for the family if you have to, and to die for it if you're told to. Sammy didn't need time to think about his answer. Everything in his life had been leading to this moment. Every fight, every job, every show of loyalty and skill had been preparation for the chance to join the most exclusive and powerful criminal organization in America. I'm ready, he said simply. The formal initiation ceremony took place on a cold December night in 1964. In the basement of a funeral home that had been serving the neighborhood's Italian families for 3 generations. The setting was appropriate. This was a kind of death and rebirth. The end of Salvatore Gravano, the individual, and the beginning of Sammy Gravano, the made man. The ceremony itself was ancient, unchanged for centuries, full of ritual and symbols that connected the new member to generations of men who had taken the same oath under similar conditions. Sammy knelt before a table with the image of a saint, held a burning piece of paper in his cupped hands, and said the words that would define the rest of his life. I enter into this organization to protect my family and to protect all my friends. I swear not to tell this secret and to obey with love and omerta. I enter alive into this organization and leave it only in death. As the paper burned in his hands, Sammy felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. He was now part of something bigger than himself. Connected to a tradition, it went back to the hills of Sicily and forward to an uncertain but possibly glorious future. The men who watched his initiation, Toto Arello, several other capos, and the family's underboss welcomed him with hugs and congratulations. But their faces were serious, almost solemn. They understood the importance of what had just happened, the irreversible step that had been taken. At 19 years old, Sammy Gravano had achieved what many men in their world spent their whole careers trying to get. He was a made member of the Gambino family. He was entitled to respect throughout the criminal community, protected by the most powerful organization in American organized crime, and in a position to rise as high as his abilities and ambitions could take him. The education part of his criminal career was over. The real work was about to begin. The middle 1960s were a golden age for organized crime in New York, and Sammy Gravano found himself perfectly placed to take advantage of the opportunities that prosperity and social change were creating. As a newly made member of the Gambino family, he had access to resources, connections, and protection that let him think beyond the street-level activities of his teenage years. His first major independent business was a construction company. He started with several other young members of Toto's crew. On the surface, Gravano Construction was a real business that bid on city contracts, built houses, and did renovation work for business clients all over Brooklyn. But under this respectable front, it worked as both a money-cleaning operation and a base for the kind of sophisticated criminal businesses that were becoming more common in New York's construction industry. The construction business in New York had always been good ground for organized crime. The industry was heavily unionized, relied on complicated networks of subcontractors and suppliers, and worked under rules that could be manipulated by men who understood how to work the system. More importantly, it created huge amounts of cash that could be easily taken, hidden, or changed to serve criminal purposes. Sammy's approach to the construction business showed the lessons he had learned from Tato Aurello about the importance of looking legitimate while keeping criminal profit levels. Gravano Construction put in competitive bids on real projects, hired skilled workers, and delivered quality work that satisfied their real customers. But they also took cash from project budgets, sold materials to other criminal businesses at high prices, and used their real contracts as cover for a variety of illegal activities. The key to their success was Sammy's understanding that modern criminal businesses needed to be more sophisticated than the simple protection rackets and street-level gambling operations that had supported earlier generations of organized crime figures. The economy was changing, becoming more complex and connected. Smart criminals needed to change with it, or risk being left behind. One of Sammy's most profitable new ideas was his involvement in the concrete business, which was growing fast as New York went through huge city development projects throughout the 1960s. Concrete was needed for almost every major construction project in the city, and the companies that supplied it worked in a relatively closed market. It was open to the kind of manipulation organized crime had perfected in other industries. Working with other Gambino family members, Sammy helped set up what was basically a cartel that controlled concrete prices throughout much of Brooklyn and Queens. Construction companies that wanted reliable concrete supplies at reasonable prices needed to work with approved suppliers, pay agreed-upon prices, and follow labor practices decided by union representatives who happened to have close relationships with various crime families. The system was simple in its design and hugely profitable for everyone involved, except the final customers, property developers, and city agencies who found themselves paying higher prices for concrete while having little choice of suppliers. But the extra charge was usually small enough to be absorbed into overall project costs, and the reliability of supply made up for the slightly higher prices. More importantly, from Sammy's view, the concrete business gave him real income he could use to explain his increasingly expensive lifestyle. It also created enormous amounts of untraceable cash that could be invested in other criminal businesses. By 1967, Sammy was making more money than most real businessmen. He drove expensive cars, wore suits made just for him, and lived in a style that would have been impossible on any regular salary. But he was careful to keep up a modest appearance, understanding that flashy shows of wealth could attract unwanted attention from police agencies that were starting to take a more active interest in organized crime activities. His personal life during this time was complicated by the demands of his criminal career. He had married his teenage girlfriend, Deborah Sabetta, in a traditional Italian wedding that brought together hundreds of guests from all over the Brooklyn criminal community. The wedding was both a personal milestone and a business networking chance, letting Sammy strengthen relationships with other crime family members while showing his commitment to the traditional values that ruled their shared world. Deborah understood the nature of her husband's work. Though they rarely talked about specific details, she had grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same schools, and learned the same lessons about loyalty, respect, and the importance of keeping family business private. She knew her job was to keep their home as a safe place where Sammy could relax and recover from the stresses of his professional life. She did that job with the same dedication he brought to his criminal businesses. Their first child, Gerard, was born in 1968, followed 2 years later by their daughter, Karen. Being a father brought new things to Sammy's life, but it also created new pressures. He wanted to give his children every advantage, every chance, every protection his growing wealth and influence could get. But he also worried about the kind of world he was creating for them, the legacy he would leave behind, and the possibility that his criminal activities might one day threaten their safety or happiness. These worries made him start thinking more strategically about his long-term future. While he remained completely committed to his life in organized crime, he began to consider how he might place himself to benefit from changing conditions in both the criminal underworld and the real economy. One of the most important changes was happening within the Gambino family itself. Carlo Gambino, who had led the organization since the 1950s, was getting old and starting to think about who would come after him. The family was growing larger and more complex, with interests that went far beyond the traditional neighborhood-based operations that had supported earlier generations. The new criminal economy needed different skills, different approaches, and different kinds of leadership. Sammy saw that his generation of crime family members had advantages their earlier bosses didn't have. They were better educated, more sophisticated in their understanding of modern business practices, and more comfortable working in the real world when they had to. But they also faced problems earlier generations had never met. More aggressive police work, more sophisticated watching techniques, and a changing social environment that was less tolerant of the kind of violence that had once been accepted as a normal part of neighborhood life. His response was to start building what was basically a criminal group that could work effectively in many places at once. Gravano construction kept growing, taking on bigger projects and developing relationships with major developers all over the New York area. But Sammy also invested in restaurants, trucking companies, waste management firms, and other businesses that could provide both real income and cover for criminal activities. The key to managing these different interests was giving jobs to others and keeping things separate. Sammy surrounded himself with trusted partners who could handle day-to-day operations while he focused on planning and relationship management. He learned to think like a company executive, understanding that successful criminal businesses needed the same kind of professional management that characterized successful real businesses. But he never lost sight of the basic principles that ruled his world. Respect was still the most important thing. Loyalty was still the highest good. And violence, while used more carefully than in earlier times, was still the final tool for solving arguments that couldn't be settled through talking or threats. An incident from this time shows how Sammy had learned to balance these competing demands. In 1969, a real contractor named Robert Bisaccia started undercutting Gravano Construction's bids on several city projects by using non-union labor and cheaper materials. Bisaccia was not connected to organized crime. He didn't understand the unwritten rules that ruled the construction industry in Brooklyn. He apparently believed that competitive pricing and political connections would be enough to protect his business interests. An earlier generation of criminals might have solved the problem by burning Bisaccia's equipment or breaking his legs. But Sammy chose a more sophisticated approach that showed both his growing business sense and his understanding of how to work in a changing environment. Instead of attacking Bisaccia directly, Sammy arranged for him to run into a series of problems that made his low-bid plan impossible to continue. His supply deliveries started arriving late or not at all. His equipment had mysterious mechanical failures that needed expensive repairs. His workers faced harassment and threats that made many of them quit and find jobs elsewhere. Most importantly, Sammy used his connections in the city government to make sure Bisaccia's projects faced unusually strict inspections. These revealed many code violations and safety hazards. The resulting delays and required fixes wiped out any cost advantages Bisaccia's low bids had provided. They also set a pattern of problems that made him an unattractive contractor for future projects. Within 6 months, Bisaccia's business was failing. He approached Sammy through middlemen to talk about the possibility of solving their competition through some form of cooperation. The meeting happened in a restaurant Sammy partly owned, on neutral ground where both men could speak freely without fear of immediate violence. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot," Bisaccia said, clearly hoping to find some face-saving way to stop bidding against Gravano construction. Sammy was gracious in victory. "Business is business," he replied. "There's room for everybody in this industry, as long as everybody understands the rules and shows the right respect." They worked out a deal that let Bisaccia keep working while staying away from projects Gravano construction considered to be in its area. It was a solution that avoided bloodshed, kept police attention to a minimum, and set an example that would discourage other potential competitors from making similar mistakes. By the end of the 1960s, Sammy Gravano had made himself one of the most successful and respected young members of the Gambino family. His criminal businesses were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. His real businesses provided both cover and extra income. His reputation for intelligence and discretion had brought him to the attention of the family's senior leadership. But the world around him was changing in ways that would challenge everything he had learned about how organized crime worked in America. The 1970s would bring new laws, new enforcement techniques, and new social pressures that would force him to change or risk becoming irrelevant. The skills that had served him well in the neighborhood-based criminal economy of the 1960s would need to be adapted to a more complex and dangerous environment, where the stakes were higher and the room for error was almost zero. The building phase of Sammy Gravano's criminal career was ending. The survival phase was about to begin. The death of Carlo Gambino in October 1976 marked the end of one time and the beginning of a new chapter in both the history of America's most powerful crime family and Sammy Gravano's rise through its ranks. Gambino had ruled for more than 20 years, building his organization into a sophisticated criminal business with interests all over New York and beyond. His death created a crisis over who would succeed him. This would reshape the family's structure and finally give ambitious men like Sammy chances for advancement they'd never had before. The leadership went to Paul Castellano, Gambino's brother-in-law and longtime underboss, though not without argument. Many family members had expected the leadership to pass to Aniello Dellacroce, a more traditional mob figure who commanded greater respect among the street-level soldiers and capos who formed the organization's operational backbone. Dellacroce was passed over, supposedly because of his age and health problems. But many believe the decision showed Castellano's superior political skills and family connections, rather than his qualifications as a leader. Castellano represented a new kind of crime family boss. He was more businessman than street fighter, more interested in sophisticated white-collar crimes than traditional neighborhood rackets. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island instead of a modest home in Brooklyn. He wore expensive suits made by the same designers who dressed real business executives. He preferred boardroom talks to back-alley violence. For Sammy Gravano, Castellano's rise represented both opportunity and challenge. The new boss was looking for people under him who could work effectively in the real business world while keeping the discipline and loyalty that had always characterized successful crime family members. Sammy's combination of street credibility and business sense made him exactly the kind of person Castellano needed to make his vision of a more sophisticated, more profitable criminal organization real. The opportunity came in 1978, when Castellano decided to reorganize the family's construction interests into a more centralized and efficient operation. The construction industry had always been important to the Gambinos, but Castellano imagined something much bigger, a coordinated effort to control major parts of the industry all over the New York area. Sammy was chosen to lead this effort, a responsibility that effectively made him one of the most powerful figures in the family. Despite his relatively young age, the appointment showed both Castellano's confidence in his abilities and the boss's understanding that the construction industry needed someone who could function equally well in real business settings and traditional criminal environments. The center of the new organization was something called the Concrete Club, though that name was never used in official communications or formal meetings. The club was basically a cartel that brought together representatives from the major crime families to coordinate their involvement in the concrete supply industry. By working together instead of competing, the families could control prices, divide areas, and make sure all major construction projects in New York paid something to organized crime in one form or another. Sammy's role in the Concrete Club was both operational and diplomatic. He helped set the pricing structures member companies would follow, settled arguments between different families over area boundaries, and served as the main connection between the criminal organizations and the real businesses that depended on their concrete supplies. The system worked with remarkable efficiency. Construction companies that wanted reliable concrete supplies at predictable prices could work with club-approved suppliers and face no problems with their projects. Companies that tried to get around the system by working with independent suppliers often found themselves facing labor arguments, material shortages, and regulation problems that made their projects unprofitable or impossible to finish. The extra charge imposed by the Concrete Club was usually modest, typically 5 to 10% above what truly competitive pricing would have been. But when applied to the billions of dollars worth of construction projects done in New York during the late 1970s and early 1980s, even small percentage increases created enormous profits for the participating crime families. Sammy's personal share of these profits was big, but more important was the respect and influence that came with managing such a complex and sensitive operation. He was no longer just another successful criminal businessman. He was now a figure of national importance within organized crime, someone whose decisions affected the money interests of multiple crime families, and whose judgment was trusted by some of the most powerful criminals in America. The success of the Concrete Club led to similar efforts in other industries. Sammy became involved in coordinating organized crime's involvement in waste management, trucking, and restaurant supply businesses. Each industry presented unique challenges and opportunities, but the basic model stayed the same. Use criminal influence to create controlled markets that made steady profits for participating organizations, while looking legitimate to outside observers. Perhaps the most ambitious of these businesses was the waste management cartel that appeared in the early 1980s. The waste disposal industry in New York was split among dozens of small companies that competed aggressively for business and city contracts. Most of these companies worked with thin profit margins and were open to the kind of market manipulation organized crime had perfected in other industries. Working with representatives from other crime families, Sammy helped set up a system that divided the city area into exclusive areas. Each participating company was guaranteed a monopoly within their assigned region. Customers who wanted reliable waste disposal services at reasonable prices could work with the assigned company for their area and face no problems. Customers who tried to switch to cheaper competitors often found that their new waste disposal company had mysterious problems that made reliable service impossible. The waste management cartel was even more profitable than the concrete club because it involved ongoing service, contracts instead of one-time construction projects. Once a customer was assigned to a particular waste disposal company, they typically stayed with that company for years, creating steady money streams that could be predicted and managed like any other business investment. But the most important development during Sammy's rise to importance within the Castellano organization was his growing relationship with John Gotti, capo from the family's Queens group, who shared Sammy's combination of street credibility and business ambition. Gotti was everything Paul Castellano was not. Flashy where Castellano was quiet. Impulsive where Castellano was calculating. Loved by street-level criminals where Castellano was respected, but not particularly liked. Their first major collaboration came in 1980, when a disagreement arose between the Gambino family and a crew from the Lucchese family over control of gambling operations at Kennedy Airport. The disagreement had the potential to grow into the kind of violent conflict that would attract police attention and disrupt profitable business relationships throughout the criminal community. Castellano assigned Sammy and Gotti to work together to solve the situation. He recognized that their different skills and approaches might work well together. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define both their careers and finally reshape the Gambino family's leadership structure. Gotti's approach to the airport disagreement was characteristically direct. He wanted to show superior firepower, scare the Lucchese crew into leaving, and establish the Gambino's control through a show of force that would discourage future challenges. Sammy preferred a more subtle plan that would solve the immediate problem, while avoiding the violence and attention that might create bigger problems. Their solution was simple in its design. Instead of confronting the Lucchese crew directly, they arranged for several of their key people to be arrested on unrelated charges. This removed them from active duty without creating martyrs or causing retaliation. Meanwhile, they negotiated a face-saving agreement with the show Lucchese family leadership that let both organizations claim victory, while dividing the airport's gambling money in a way that satisfied everyone's money interests. The success of this collaboration set a pattern that would characterize Sammy and Gotti's relationship for the next several years. Gotti provided the charm and street credibility that inspired fierce loyalty among the family soldiers and associates. He was a natural leader who commanded respect through his personal presence, and his reputation for standing up to anyone who challenged the family's interests. Sammy provided the strategic thinking and business skill that turned Gotti's instinctive leadership into systematic criminal business. Where Gotti saw chances for expansion and control, Sammy developed the detailed plans and organizational structures that made those chances profitable and lasting. But their partnership also highlighted growing tensions within the Gambino family between the old guard, represented by Paul Castellano, and the new generation, represented by figures like Gotti and Gravano. Castellano's emphasis on sophisticated white-collar crimes and real business investments was profitable, but it distanced him from the street-level activities that had traditionally been the foundation of crime family power. Many of the family soldiers and capos felt Castellano had lost touch with the realities of criminal life. His mansion on Staten Island and his preference for business meetings over neighborhood gatherings showed a basic misunderstanding of what made organized crime effective. They respected his intelligence and his ability to make profits, but they questioned his commitment to the values and traditions that had kept their organization going through earlier challenges. These tensions came to a head in 1985, when federal prosecutors in Manhattan announced a massive racketeering case against the leadership of several New York crime families. The case, which became known as the Commission Trial, charged Paul Castellano and other top organized crime figures with running a criminal business that had systematically corrupted major parts of the New York economy. The indictment was based on years of watching wiretapped conversations and testimony from informants who had given law enforcement unprecedented insight into how organized crime actually worked. For the first time in American history, federal prosecutors felt confident they could prove in court that the Mafia was a real organization with formal structures, established procedures, and documented criminal activities. Castellano's reaction to the indictment was characteristically businesslike. He hired expensive lawyers, began preparing a defense plan, and kept conducting family business as if the legal proceedings were just another operational challenge that could be managed through proper planning and resource use. But other family members were less optimistic about their boss's chances. The evidence against Castellano appeared overwhelming. A conviction would almost certainly mean a life sentence, effectively ending his leadership of the organization. More troubling was the possibility that Castellano might decide to cooperate with prosecutors to reduce his sentence, betraying the organization's secrets in exchange for personal consideration. John Gotti began to argue privately that the family needed new leadership, someone who understood that the old ways of doing business were no longer enough in an environment where law enforcement had become more sophisticated and more aggressive. He believed Castellano's arrest provided an opportunity to put in a boss who would return the family to its roots. While adapting to new realities, Sammy found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position between his official loyalty to Paul Castellano and his growing belief that Gotti's analysis was correct. The legal system had changed the rules of the game. Successful adaptation would need different leadership, different plans, and different priorities than had worked in earlier times. The decision about what to do would finally determine not just the future of the Gambino family, but also Sammy Gravano's place within the organization and his chances for long-term survival in an increasingly dangerous world. The comfortable certainties of the Castellano years were ending, and what would replace them was far from clear. December 16, 1985, was a cold Monday evening in Manhattan. Early winter darkness settled over the streets as rush-hour traffic began to thin. At Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, reservations had been made for a dinner meeting that was supposed to solve some pressing family business. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, was scheduled to meet with several of his capos to discuss plans for the upcoming commission trial and other matters needing his attention. What Castellano didn't know was that this dinner meeting was a trap, carefully arranged by John Gotti and a small group of plotters who had decided the family's survival needed new leadership. Among those plotters was Sammy Gravano, who had struggled with his conscience for months before concluding that his loyalty to the organization was more important than his personal duty to Paul Castellano. The decision to remove Castellano had not been made lightly or quickly. It represented the result of years of growing unhappiness with his leadership style, strategic choices, and apparent disconnect from the realities facing the family's street-level operations. But the immediate reason was Castellano's legal troubles and the very real possibility that he might cooperate with federal prosecutors to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. Gotti had been building support for his position throughout 1985, carefully finding out what other family members thought about their concerns regarding Castellano's leadership. The conversations were necessarily indirect. Directly suggesting the murder of a sitting boss was an extremely dangerous position to take if word got back to the wrong people. But slowly, Gotti had put together a group of supporters who shared his belief that dramatic action was necessary. Sammy's recruitment to the plot was a crucial development, both because of his reputation for strategic thinking and because of his close relationships with other powerful figures within the family. When Gotti approached him about the possibility of making a change, Sammy understood immediately what was being suggested and what would be expected of him if he agreed to take part. This isn't about personal ambition, Gotti explained during a carefully private conversation in November 1985. This is about survival. Paul's lost touch with what this family is supposed to be about. He's more interested in his construction deals and his real businesses than he is in protecting the soldiers who do the real work. And now, with these federal cases coming down, he's talking about plea bargains and cooperation agreements like he's some kind of white-collar criminal instead of a man of honor. Sammy had heard similar complaints from other family members, and he shared many of their concerns. Castellano's emphasis on sophisticated criminal businesses had been profitable, but it had also created distance between the leadership and the organization's traditional base of support. More importantly, the legal pressures facing the family needed leadership that understood both the streets and the courtrooms, someone who could keep discipline while adapting to new realities. What you're talking about, Sammy said carefully, is something that can't be undone. Once we cross that line, there's no going back. We better be absolutely sure it's necessary, and that we can do it without destroying the family in the process. Gotti nodded gravely. I've thought about nothing else for months. Paul's finished whether we act or not. The feds have him dead to rights, and he knows it. The question is whether we let him take the family down with him, or whether we do what needs to be done to protect the organization. The planning for what would become known as the hit of the century took weeks of careful preparation. Every detail had to be considered, every possible problem planned for, every potential witness or complication accounted for. This wasn't a typical organized crime murder that could be done in some isolated place with little risk of detection. This was the public killing of one of the most powerful crime bosses in America, done in the heart of Manhattan during evening rush hour. The team put together for the operation showed both the importance of the target and the complexity of the plan. Besides Gotti and Sammy, the main plotters included Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's closest friend and longtime partner in various criminal businesses, Frank DiCicco, a respected capo whose support made the plot okay with family traditionalists, and Anthony Tony Roach Rampino, a feared killer whose reputation for violence would help scare potential opposition. The actual shooters would be soldiers and associates who could be trusted to follow orders without asking questions, and who had shown their skill in previous violent operations. But the organizers understood that their own presence at the scene would be essential to send the right message to both family members and possible rivals about who was responsible for the change in leadership. Castellano's movements and security procedures had been studied for weeks. Unlike some crime bosses who surrounded themselves with extensive security details, Castellano typically traveled with only 1 or 2 bodyguards. He relied more on his reputation and the general understanding that attacks on family leaders were extremely rare and always led to massive payback. The dinner meeting at Sparks had been suggested by Frank DiCicco, who was trusted by Castellano and whose recommendation would not arouse suspicion. The restaurant was chosen because it offered several strategic advantages: multiple escape routes, heavy foot traffic that would provide cover for the shooter's approach and getaway, and a location that would make it difficult for Castellano's bodyguards to set up effective security. On the evening of December 16th, Sammy positioned himself across the street from Sparks. He looked like he was window shopping, but he was actually serving as a lookout and coordinator for the operation. He was dressed in an expensive overcoat and carried himself with the casual confidence of a successful businessman enjoying an evening in Manhattan. To casual observers, he was no different from the hundreds of other well-dressed professionals in the area during evening hours. His role in the murder was crucial, but not immediately visible. While Gotti would be the obvious successor to Castellano's position, and while the actual shooters would carry out the physical act of murder, Sammy was responsible for making sure the operation went according to plan and that all participants understood their jobs and timing. Through a small radio hidden in his coat, Sammy kept in touch with other members of the plot, placed at strategic locations all over the area. When Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of the restaurant at about 5:25 p.m., Sammy sent the agreed-upon signal. "The party's here." What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but changed the history of American organized crime forever. As Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bilotti stepped out of their car, 4 men in identical long coats and Russian-style fur hats approached from different directions. The timing was perfect, the result of weeks of practice and planning. The shooters opened fire at the same time, using .38 caliber revolvers that had been carefully prepared for the operation. Castellano was hit 6 times and died instantly on the sidewalk outside one of New York's most famous restaurants. Bilotti, trying to draw his own weapon, was shot 3 times and fell beside his boss. The killers disappeared into the crowd with the same precision they had shown in approaching their targets. Within minutes, they had gotten rid of their distinctive coats and hats, changed their appearance, and vanished into the Manhattan evening. By the time police arrived at the scene, the only evidence of their presence was the bodies of 2 of the most powerful men in organized crime. Sammy watched the whole operation unfold from his position across the street. His face carefully blank. He had taken part in many violent crimes over the years, but nothing approaching the importance of this public killing. The successful murder of Paul Castellano represented both the ultimate show of organized crime's power and a basic transformation in how that power would be used. As sirens began to wail in the distance and crowds of curious onlookers gathered around the crime scene, Sammy calmly walked away from the area. He followed a planned route that would take him to a safe place where he could watch news coverage and wait for further instructions from Gotti. The immediate aftermath of the murder was carefully arranged to keep chaos within the Gambino family to a minimum while sending clear messages to possible rivals and police agencies. Within hours of Castellano's death, John Gotti had taken control of family operations, with Frank DeCicco serving as his underboss and Sammy being raised to the position of capo, with bigger responsibilities for the family's most profitable businesses. The transition was remarkably smooth, showing both the plotters' careful planning and the widespread support for change among family members who had grown unhappy with Castellano's leadership style. Instead of the violent power struggle that often followed the murder of a crime boss, the Gambino family experienced what was basically a peaceful transfer of power. This strengthened rather than weakened the organization. Media coverage of the murder was extensive and largely focused on the bold nature of the crime rather than its possible meanings for law enforcement efforts against organized crime. The image of Paul Castellano lying dead on a Manhattan sidewalk became famous, symbolizing both the continuing power of the Mafia and the willingness of its leaders to use extreme violence to solve internal arguments. But within law enforcement agencies, the murder was seen as a possible turning point that might provide new opportunities to get inside and disrupt organized crime operations. The public nature of the killing, the obvious planning and coordination needed, and the clear succession of leadership that followed all suggested that prosecutors might be able to build cases that would be much harder for defendants to deny or explain away. FBI watching teams had been monitoring various Gambino family members for months as part of ongoing investigations. They had accidentally documented some of the activities leading up to Castellano's murder. While they hadn't been able to prevent the murder, they now had evidence that might be useful in building cases against the killers. More importantly, the murder created new pressures and weak points within the organization that law enforcement might be able to use. Family members who had been loyal to Castellano might be willing to cooperate with authorities if they felt threatened by the new leadership. Business partners who had worked with Castellano's real businesses might be more willing to provide information if they feared being targeted by Gotti's more aggressive approach to criminal operations. For Sammy, the successful murder of Paul Castellano represented both the high point of his rise through the Gambino family order and the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career. As one of Gotti's most trusted partners and a key participant in the plot that had brought the new boss to power, he was in a position to benefit enormously from the changes transforming the organization. His construction businesses, waste management operations, and other business interests would keep working under the protection and with the support of the family's new leadership. But more importantly, he would now have access to opportunities and resources that had been unavailable under Castellano's more conservative approach to criminal business. Gotti's vision for the Gambino family was more aggressive and more traditional than his predecessors had been. Where Castellano had emphasized sophisticated white-collar crimes and real business investments, Gotti wanted to return to the street-level activities that had traditionally been the foundation of organized crime power. He believed the family's strength came from its connection to neighborhood-based criminal operations and its willingness to use violence to make people do what it wanted. This philosophical difference had deep meanings for how the family would work in the new environment created by increasingly aggressive federal law enforcement efforts. Gotti's approach was more likely to create the kind of evidence prosecutors could use in court, but it was also more likely to inspire loyalty among family members who felt their new boss understood and respected their contributions to the organization. For Sammy, these changes created both opportunities and challenges. His proven loyalty to Gotti and his key role in the plot that had brought the new boss to power guaranteed him an important position in the reorganized family structure. But the more aggressive approach Gotti favored also meant greater risks, more police attention, and higher stakes for everyone involved in family operations. The murder of Paul Castellano marked the end of one time in the history of the Gambino crime family and the beginning of another. It established John Gotti as one of the most powerful and visible crime bosses in America, with Sammy Gravano serving as his most trusted assistant and strategic advisor. But it also set in motion a series of events that would finally lead to the downfall of both men and the destruction of much of what they had worked their entire careers to build. The very boldness that had made the Castellano murder possible would finally prove to be their undoing. As law enforcement agencies adapted their methods to the new realities of organized crime, and as the results of their violent actions began to catch up with them, the golden age of John Gotti and Sammy Gravano was about to begin. But so was the countdown to their final destruction. The years immediately following Paul Castellano's murder marked the highest point of John Gotti's power and influence within the American Mafia, and, by extension, the time of Sammy Gravano's greatest authority and prosperity within the criminal underworld. Together, They transformed the Gambino family into what many considered the most powerful and feared organized crime organization in the United States, while at the same time making themselves targets of the most intensive law enforcement investigation in the history of American organized crime. Gotti's rise to the position of family boss was made official in a formal ceremony held just weeks after Castellano's death. It took place in a private room in a restaurant in Queens that had been carefully secured against electronic listening. The ceremony followed ancient traditions that connected the new boss to generations of Mafia leaders, while adapting to the modern realities of criminal business in the 1980s. Sammy's rise to the position of underboss was announced at the same ceremony, making him, at age 40, one of the youngest men ever to hold such a high position in a major crime family. The appointment showed not only Gotti's trust in his strategic abilities, but also the new boss's understanding that the changing world of organized crime needed leadership that could adapt to evolving challenges. The partnership between Gotti and Gravano was complementary in ways that made their combined leadership extraordinarily effective. Gotti had the charm and street credibility that inspired fierce loyalty among the family soldiers and associates. He was a natural leader who commanded respect through his personal presence and his reputation for standing up to anyone who challenged the family's interests. Sammy provided the analytical thinking and business skill that turned Gotti's instinctive leadership into systematic criminal business, where Gotti saw chances for expansion and control. Sammy developed the detailed plans and organizational structures that made those chances profitable and lasting. Their complementary skills were clear in how they restructured the family's operations to maximize both profits and power. Under Castellano, the organization had been run like a loose group of semi-independent crews that paid money to the boss while managing their own areas and criminal businesses. Gotti and Sammy centralized authority while keeping the flexibility that let individual operators pursue their own opportunities within the overall framework of family policy. The center of their new approach was an expansion of the construction industry operations that had made Sammy wealthy and powerful during the Castellano years. But where the previous leadership had focused mainly on concrete supply and general contracting, the new leadership extended organized crime's reach into almost every part of the building trades all over the New York area. The key was understanding that modern construction projects needed coordination among dozens of different specialties: electrical work, plumbing, steel fabrication, masonry, carpentry, and many others. By establishing influence or control over multiple trades at the same time, the family could make sure their interests were protected at every stage of major construction projects, while also maximizing their profit opportunities. Sammy led this expansion, using his existing relationships with contractors, union officials, and city workers to create what was basically a shadow government that worked parallel to real regulatory and business structures. Projects that had the family's approval went smoothly and profitably for everyone involved. Projects that didn't have such approval often ran into mysterious problems that made them expensive, time-consuming, or impossible to finish. The waste management operations Sammy had helped set up during the late 1970s were similarly expanded under the new leadership. What had begun as area arrangements among competing crime families turned into a comprehensive cartel that controlled garbage collection throughout much of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The profits created by these expanded operations were enormous, but more important was the political and money influence they provided. Construction companies and waste management firms that depended on organized crimes protection or cooperation found themselves in relationships that went far beyond simple business transactions. They became part of a network of mutual obligation and shared interest that gave the family influence in real business and political circles that earlier generations of criminals had never had. This influence was particularly valuable when dealing with law enforcement investigations and prosecutions. While the family could not prevent federal agencies from pursuing their cases, they could sometimes influence how those cases were investigated, what evidence was available to prosecutors, and how cooperative witnesses and victims would be when testifying in court. But the most important change under the Gotti Gravano leadership was the family's approach to violence and threats. Where Castellano had preferred to solve arguments through talking and money pressure, Gotti believed that the real threat of violence was essential to keeping respect and discipline within the criminal community. This way of thinking was shown in many incidents throughout the late 1980s, when the family's response to various challenges sent clear messages about the results of opposing their interests. Business competitors who refused to respect area boundaries found themselves facing escalating problems that ended in physical attacks on their property or people. Law enforcement informants discovered that their cooperation with authorities made them targets for payback they could extend to their families and partners. One of the most important shows of the new leadership's approach came in 1987, when a rival crime family tried to move into several of the Gambino's most profitable gambling operations in Queens. Instead of negotiating an area compromise, as Castellano might have done, Gotti and Sammy decided to respond with overwhelming force that would discourage future challenges while solidifying their reputation for ruthlessness. The campaign against the invaders was quick, systematic, and terrible. In a period of 2 weeks, 3 members of the rival organization were murdered in public places throughout Queens. Their deaths were clearly linked to their attempts to move into Gambino area. Several others were severely beaten and left with permanent injuries that served as visible reminders of what happened to people who challenged the family's interests. More importantly, the family's response included attacks on the rival organization's real business interests and family members. This showed that the results of opposing the Gambinos went far beyond the individuals directly involved in criminal activities. The message was received and understood throughout the criminal community. The Gambino family under Gotti and Gravano was not an organization that could be challenged without punishment. These shows of power had their intended effect on both criminal rivals and real business partners. The family's areas became more secure, their criminal businesses more profitable, and their influence more extensive than had been the case under any previous leadership. By the late 1980s, the Gambino family was widely recognized as the best organized crime organization in the United States, with operations that created hundreds of millions of dollars a year, an influence that reached into real business, labor unions, and political circles. But the same aggressive approach that made the family so powerful also made it a priority target for federal law enforcement. Agencies that were developing new methods and technologies for investigating organized crime. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO Act, passed in 1970 but not fully used until the 1980s, gave prosecutors legal tools specifically designed to take apart criminal organizations like the one Gotti and Sammy had built. Under RICO, prosecutors could charge the leaders of criminal organizations not just with specific crimes, but with running criminal businesses that systematically broke federal law. The punishments for RICO violations were severe, potentially life imprisonment for leaders of organizations that could be shown to have engaged in patterns of criminal activity over long periods. More troubling from the family's point of view was the sophisticated, watching technology federal agencies were using against organized crime targets. Electronic listening, wiretapped telephone conversations, and hidden cameras were giving law enforcement unprecedented insight into how criminal organizations actually worked, what their leaders actually said when they thought they were speaking privately, and how their various businesses were actually structured and managed. The FBI had been doing intensive watching of Gotti and other family members since shortly after Castellano's murder. They understood that the new leadership represented both a more dangerous criminal organization and a more open target for prosecution. Their investigations were creating evidence that would have been impossible to get through traditional methods. Recorded conversations in which criminal activities were discussed in detail, documentation of money flows between real and fake businesses, and testimony from wiretap sources who revealed the internal workings of the organization. By 1989, federal prosecutors in Manhattan had put together what they believed was a complete case against the Gambino family's leadership, based on years of watching, dozens of recorded conversations, and testimony from several cooperating witnesses who had provided detailed information about the organization's structure and activities. The indictments, when they finally came, would represent the most serious challenge any American crime family had ever faced from law enforcement. Unlike previous prosecutions that had focused on specific crimes or individual criminals, the new cases were designed to destroy entire organizations by imprisoning their leadership and taking their property. For John Gotti and Sammy Gravano, the golden years of power and prosperity were about to end. The very success that had made them legends in the criminal underworld had also made them targets of a legal system that was finally equipped with the tools and techniques necessary to bring down even the most powerful organized crime figures. The countdown to their destruction had already begun, though they didn't yet understand how little time they had left. By 1990, the walls were closing in on the Gambino family with the unstoppable pressure of a slowly tightening clamp. Federal investigators had spent nearly 5 years building cases against John Gotti and his organization, using watching techniques and legal strategies that represented the latest in law enforcement's war against organized crime. What they had put together was not just evidence of specific criminal acts, but a complete documentation of how the most powerful crime family in America actually worked. The investigation was centered at the FBI's New York office, where a task force of agents, prosecutors, and analysts had made the destruction of the Gambino family their main mission. They had invested thousands of hours in watching operations, used the most sophisticated electronic listening equipment available, and recruited informants who provided unprecedented insight into the organization's internal workings. The breakthrough had come in 1989, when FBI agents succeeded in planting listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, which served as Gotti's unofficial headquarters. The club was where he met with people under him, discussed family business, and made the decisions that affected criminal operations all over New York and beyond for months. The FBI recorded conversations that provided exactly the kind of evidence RICO prosecutions needed. Detailed discussions of criminal activities, planning sessions for illegal businesses, and most damaging of all, Gotti's own words describing his role as the leader of a criminal organization and his approval of various crimes committed by his people. But perhaps the most shocking discovery for investigators was the extent to which Gotti criticized and looked down on Sammy Gravano in private conversations. Despite their public appearance of partnership and mutual respect, the wiretapped conversations revealed Gotti complaining about his underboss's business methods, questioning his loyalty, and expressing frustration with what he saw as Sammy's excessive focus on real business investments. That fat expletive thinks he's smarter than everybody else, Gotti was recorded saying in one particularly damaging conversation. He's got his construction deals and his restaurants, and he thinks he's some kind of real businessman. But when push comes to shove, he better remember who made him and who can break him. The FBI agents monitoring these conversations understood immediately that they had discovered a possible weakness in what appeared to be an unbreakable partnership. If Gotti was privately expressing doubts about Gravano's loyalty, and if Gravano was unaware of his boss's true feelings, there might be an opportunity to create a split between the two men that could help the prosecution's case. The strategy that came from this insight would prove to be one of the most successful law enforcement operations in the history of organized crime investigation. Instead of simply building cases against both men at the same time, prosecutors decided to arrest them together, but then give Gravano evidence of Gotti's private criticisms. They hoped to convince him that his loyalty to his boss was not returned, and that his best chance for survival lay in cooperation with the government. The arrests came on December 11, 1990, as coordinated raids swept through Brooklyn and Queens. They targeted not just Gotti and Gravano, but dozens of other family members and associates. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. More than 100 FBI agents took part in arrests designed to break the Gambino family's entire leadership structure at the same time. Gotti was arrested at the Ravenite Social Club, handcuffed in front of a gathered crowd of neighborhood residents and media, representatives attracted by the huge law enforcement presence. The image of the dapper Don being led away in handcuffs became one of the most famous photographs in the history of organized crime prosecution, symbolizing the government's determination to bring down even the most powerful criminal leaders. Sammy was arrested at his home in Brooklyn, surrounded by FBI agents who had been watching his movements for months and knew exactly when and where to find him. Unlike Gotti, who kept his characteristic boldness even in handcuffs, Sammy appeared shaken by the arrest. He perhaps understood more clearly than his boss how serious their legal situation had become. The indictments that followed the arrests were complete and terrible. Under Rishu laws, Gotti and Gravano were charged not just with specific crimes, but with running a criminal business that had systematically corrupted major parts of the New York economy. The charges included murder, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and conspiracy, a list of criminal activities that carried possible sentences of life imprisonment without parole. But more damaging than the specific charges was the evidence prosecutors had to support them. The wiretapped conversations from the Ravenite Social Club provided direct proof of the defendants' criminal activities in their own words. Watching photographs documented meetings with known criminals and participation in suspicious activities. Financial records traced the flow of money between real businesses and illegal businesses. Perhaps most importantly, several members of the organization had already agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, providing insider testimony about how the family worked and what roles various individuals played in its criminal activities. These cooperating witnesses could provide context and explanation for the electronic evidence while also testifying about crimes that had not been caught on listening equipment. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, a young but experienced prosecutor who had made organized crime cases his specialty. Gleason understood that this was possibly a career-defining case that could either establish his reputation as one of the country's most effective prosecutors or damage it permanently if the defendants were found not guilty. Despite the extensive evidence against them, Gleason's strategy was methodical and complete. Instead of focusing on a few dramatic incidents, he planned to present evidence of the whole scope of the defendants' criminal activities. He would show the jury not just that crimes had been committed, but that the defendants had created and managed a systematic criminal organization that corrupted real businesses, terrorized honest citizens, and created enormous profits through illegal activities. For Gotti, the prosecution represented the ultimate test of his ability to beat the legal system that had been trying unsuccessfully to convict him for decades. He had been arrested many times throughout his career, but had never been successfully prosecuted on serious charges, earning him a reputation as the Teflon Dome, because criminal charges never seemed to stick to him. His approach to the new charges was consistent with his previous strategy: hire the best defense lawyers available, attack the credibility of government witnesses, and rely on his reputation and charm to convince jurors he was being persecuted rather than prosecuted. He believed his previous not guilty verdicts showed that the government's cases against him were basically weak, and that this prosecution would end the same way as the others. But Sammy's situation was more complex and possibly more dangerous. Unlike Gotti, he had no experience with major federal prosecutions and no established record of beating serious criminal charges. His criminal career had been built on avoiding arrests and prosecutions rather than surviving them, and the evidence against him appeared to be much more extensive and damaging than anything he had faced before. More troubling was his slow realization that his relationship with Gotti was not what he had believed it to be. The wiretapped conversations prosecutors played for him during pre-trial proceedings revealed a pattern of criticism and disrespect that completely contradicted Gotti's public treatment of him as a trusted partner and valued advisor. "You need to understand something," Prosecutor Gleason told Sammy during one of their early meetings. "John Gotti doesn't respect you. He doesn't trust you. And he certainly doesn't care about what happens to you." These are his own words, recorded when he thought nobody was listening. "He thinks you're weak. He thinks you're greedy. And he thinks you're expendable." The revelation was terrible for Sammy, who had believed his loyalty to Gotti was returned and that their partnership was based on genuine mutual respect. To learn he'd been deceived about something so basic challenged everything he thought. He understood about his position within the organization and his chances for surviving the legal challenges they were facing. The prosecution strategy was working exactly as intended. By showing Gravano that his loyalty to Gotti was not returned, they were creating conditions that might make him reconsider his options and possibly decide that cooperation with the government was his best chance for survival. But the decision Sammy was being asked to make was not just about legal strategy or personal survival. It was about betraying everything he had believed in for his entire adult life. It was about breaking the oath he had taken as a made member of the Gambino family and abandoning the code of silence that had ruled his behavior for more than 25 years. The choice he finally made would not just determine his own fate. It would basically change the world of American organized crime and set examples that would influence law enforcement strategies for decades to come. The most famous turncoat in the history of organized crime was about to be born. The federal detention facility in Manhattan was a gray concrete monument to the idea that justice required removing dangerous individuals from society while their cases went through the courts. For John Gotti and Sammy Gravano, it became their home for months as they waited for trial on charges that could result in life imprisonment. Sterile environment where the only sounds were the echoes of footsteps on concrete floors and the metallic clang of doors that locked automatically behind anyone who passed through them. The facility held hundreds of defendants waiting for trial on federal charges. But few commanded the attention and respect that Gotti received from both inmates and correctional staff. Even in prison clothes, he kept the bearing and confidence that had made him a legend in the criminal underworld. He treated his confinement as a temporary inconvenience rather than a serious threat to his future. Sammy's adjustment to being locked up was more difficult. While he had been arrested before, he had never faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. He had never been confronted with evidence that appeared as overwhelming as what the prosecutors had put together against him. The walls of his cell seemed to close in on him during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and he found himself thinking about a future that looked increasingly bleak. The two men were housed in different sections of the facility, partly for security reasons and partly because prosecutors hoped that limiting their communication might create opportunities for one or both of them to reconsider their options. But even when they were able to meet, their conversations were limited by the knowledge that everything they said might be listened to and recorded for use against them at trial. It was during one of these awkward meetings that Sammy first raised the possibility that their situation might be more serious than Gotti seemed to believe. "John, I've been looking at the evidence they say they have against us," Sammy said carefully, knowing their conversation might be overheard. "This isn't like your previous cases. They've got recordings, photographs, financial documents, and cooperating witnesses. This is different." Gotti's response was characteristically confident. "It's never different," he said dismissively. "The government always claims they have an airtight case, and then when we get to trial, their witnesses fall apart, and their evidence turns out to be garbage. We've been through this before, and we'll beat it again." But Sammy had been studying the prosecution's evidence more carefully than his boss, and what he saw genuinely frightened him. The wiretapped conversations were particularly damaging because they captured both men, discussing criminal activities in their own voices, using language that would be hard to explain away or reinterpret for a jury. More troubling were the financial records that traced money flows between their real businesses and their illegal businesses. Sammy had always prided himself on the sophistication of his money-cleaning operations, but the government's financial investigators had apparently succeeded in following paper trails he had believed were impossible to trace. Perhaps most damaging of all were the cooperating witnesses who were providing insider testimony about the organization's structure and activities. These weren't street-level criminals whose credibility could be easily attacked, but longtime family members who had detailed knowledge of the most sensitive aspects of the organization's operations. As the weeks passed and more details of the prosecution's case became available through the discovery process, Sammy found himself increasingly convinced that conviction was not just possible but probable. The evidence was simply too extensive, too detailed, and too well supported to be effectively challenged through traditional defense strategies. But what troubled him even more than the strength of the government's case was his growing realization that his relationship with Gotti was basically different from what he had believed. The prosecutors had been selectively sharing portions of the wiretapped conversations with him, and what he heard was deeply disturbing. The John Gotti captured on those recordings was not the loyal partner and respected boss Sammy thought he knew. Instead, he was a man who spoke scornfully of his underboss, questioned his competence, and seemed to view him as a useful but finally expendable person under him rather than a valued partner. "He thinks I'm weak," Sammy confided to his attorney during one of their meetings. 25 years I've been loyal to this man. 25 years I've risked everything for the family. And this is what he really thinks of me." His attorney, Benjamin Braffman, was one of New York's most experienced criminal defense lawyers, with a reputation for successfully defending clients in complex white-collar cases. But even Braffman was having difficulty seeing how they could mount an effective defense against the evidence prosecutors had put together. "The reality is that we're facing a very difficult situation," Braffman told him honestly. The government's case is stronger than anything I've seen in 20 years of practice. The recordings are terrible, the financial evidence is complete, and the cooperating witnesses are believable, unless something changes dramatically. I think we have to consider the possibility that conviction is certain. It was during these discussions with his attorney that Sammy first learned about the government's willingness to consider cooperation agreements with defendants who provided substantial assistance in prosecuting other criminals. Such agreements could result in significant sentence reductions, placement in the witness protection program, and other considerations that might make survival possible even after conviction. I'm not saying you should cooperate, Braffman emphasized. That's a decision only you can make, and it carries risks that go far beyond legal considerations. But I think you need to understand all of your options before making final decisions about how to proceed. The idea of cooperation was at first so foreign to everything Sammy believed about loyalty and honor that he refused to consider it seriously. He had taken an oath as a made member of the Gambino family that specifically required him to keep silence, even unto death, rather than betray the organization's secrets. The Code of Omerta was not just a cultural tradition. It was the foundation of his identity and the organizing principle of his entire adult life. But as the evidence against him continued to mount and his chances for a not guilty verdict continued to shrink, he found himself thinking about cooperation not as betrayal but as survival. The organization he had served so loyally for 25 years had apparently never valued his loyalty. The boss he had risked everything to support had never respected his contributions. The family he had considered more important than his biological family had never returned his devotion. The turning point came when prosecutors provided him with additional recordings that revealed the extent to which Gotti had been criticizing him to other family members. In conversation after conversation, his boss portrayed him as greedy, unreliable, and possibly disloyal, exactly the opposite of how Sammy saw himself and his contributions to the organization. This son of an expletive has been undermining me for years, he told Braffman after hearing the most damaging recordings, while I was out there making money for the family, taking risks, handling problems. He was sitting in that social club telling people I couldn't be trusted. He's destroyed my reputation within the organization while pretending to be my friend. The psychological impact of these revelations cannot be overstated. Sammy's entire adult identity had been built around his role as a loyal and valued member of the Gambino family. To learn that his loyalty had never been returned, that his contributions had never been properly valued, and that his reputation had been systematically damaged by the very person he had served most faithfully, was terrible in ways that went far beyond the immediate legal results he was facing. But there were also practical considerations that influenced his thinking. Even if he somehow managed to avoid conviction, his position within the organization had been irreparably damaged by Gotti's recorded criticisms. Other family members who heard those recordings would inevitably question his competence and reliability, making it difficult or impossible for him to work effectively in his previous role. More importantly, the aggressive law enforcement attention the family was receiving made it unlikely their criminal businesses could continue working profitably in the near future. The days of easy money from construction and waste management operations were probably over, replaced by a much more dangerous environment, where every business decision carried the risk of additional criminal charges and longer prison sentences. His family situation also weighed heavily on his decision-making process. His wife Deborah and their children had enjoyed the prosperity his criminal career had provided, but they had also lived with the constant stress and danger such a lifestyle involved. The possibility of his spending the rest of his life in prison would leave them not just emotionally destroyed, but also financially open, since much of his real business interests were likely to be taken by the government as proceeds of criminal activity. After weeks of painful consideration, Sammy made the decision that would define the rest of his life and change the history of American organized crime forever. He instructed his attorney to approach prosecutors about the possibility of a cooperation agreement that would let him provide testimony against John Gotti and other members of the Gambino family in exchange for a reduced sentence and placement in the federal witness protection program. The decision was not made lightly or quickly. It represented the abandonment of everything he had believed in for his entire adult life. The betrayal of men who had trusted him with their lives and their secrets, and the destruction of relationships that had supported him through decades of criminal activity. But it was also, as he saw it, the only reasonable response to a situation in which his loyalty had never been returned. His contributions had never been properly valued, and his future within the organization had been irreparably damaged by the very person he had served most faithfully. The most famous turncoat in the history of organized crime was about to be born, and his testimony would bring down not just John Gotti, but the entire structure of the criminal organization that had dominated New York for decades. The meeting took place on November 8, 1991, in a secure conference room at the FBI's New York field office, a sterile environment designed to prevent electronic listening while providing maximum security for participants in sensitive discussions. The room contained only a rectangular table, several chairs, and recording equipment that would preserve every word spoken during what would become one of the most significant debriefing sessions in the history of American law enforcement. Present at the meeting were Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, several FBI agents who had worked on the Gambino family investigation, and Sammy Gravano's attorney, Benjamin Gruffman. But the central figure was Sammy himself, who sat across from federal prosecutors. He had spent his entire adult life viewing his enemies, prepared to bet his life on their willingness to keep promises made in exchange for his cooperation. The atmosphere was tense, but businesslike. Everyone in the room understood the historical importance of what was about to occur. The underboss of America's most powerful crime family was prepared to break the most sacred principle of organized crime by providing detailed testimony about the organization's structure, activities, and leadership. Such cooperation was not unheard of, but it had never before involved someone of Sammy's importance and knowledge. Gleason began the debriefing session by explaining the terms of the cooperation agreement the government was prepared to offer in exchange for complete and truthful testimony about his knowledge of criminal activities within the Gambino family. Sammy would plead guilty to racketeering charges that carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, but prosecutors would recommend a significant reduction in that sentence based on the extent and value of his cooperation. More importantly, he and his immediate family would be placed in the federal witness protection program, which would provide them with new identities, relocation to a secure location, and ongoing protection from payback by organized crime figures who might want to silence him permanently. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're asking for, Gleason said, looking directly at Sammy across the table. We need complete honesty about everything you know. We need details about criminal activities you participated in or witnessed. We need information about the organizational structure of the family, the roles of various individuals, and the methods used to conduct criminal businesses if you lie to us about anything. If you hold back information that we later discover independently, the agreement is void and you'll face the maximum punishments allowed by law. Sammy nodded his understanding, though the size of what he was agreeing to was almost overwhelming. He was about to provide prosecutors with information that would result in the arrests and convictions of dozens of men who had trusted him, worked with him, and considered him family. Some of these men had been his closest friends for decades. Others had saved his life or risked their own lives to protect him. But he had crossed a psychological line from which there was no return. The wiretapped conversations had revealed to him that his loyalty to the organization had never been returned by its leadership. John Gotti's private criticisms had destroyed any remaining sense of duty he felt toward his boss, or the criminal business they had built together. "I understand what you're asking," he replied quietly, "and I'm prepared to give you what you need." What followed was the most complete debriefing of a high-level organized crime figure in American history. Over the course of 18 sessions spanning several months, Sammy provided prosecutors with detailed information about almost every aspect of the Gambino family's operations, from street-level gambling and loan sharking to sophisticated construction industry, racketeering and murder plots. His testimony was extraordinarily valuable, not just because of his high position within the organization, but because of his analytical mind and remarkable memory for detail. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who could provide only general information about criminal activities they had observed, Sammy was able to describe the complex business relationships, financial structures, and operational procedures that made the family's criminal businesses so profitable and difficult to prosecute. He explained how the concrete cartel worked, naming the specific individuals who controlled various parts of the industry, and describing the methods used to fix prices, give out contracts, and eliminate competition. He detailed the waste management operations that created millions of dollars in illegal profits, while appearing to be real business activities. He provided complete information about gambling businesses, loan sharking operations, and labor racketeering plans that prosecutors had been unable to fully understand despite years of investigation. But perhaps most significantly, he provided detailed testimony about the murders he had participated in or witnessed during his criminal career. Unlike previous cooperating witnesses who had been side figures in violent crimes, Sammy had been a central participant in 19 murders committed between 1970 and 1990, including several that had been ordered by John Gotti personally. His descriptions of these murders were clinical in their detail and terrible in their meanings for the defendants he was testifying against. He could describe not just what had happened, but why it had happened, who had ordered the killings, and how they fit into the larger patterns of organizational discipline and area control that ruled the criminal underworld. The murder of Paul Castellano was naturally a central focus of his testimony. For the first time, prosecutors had an insider's account of how the murder had been planned and done, who had participated in the plot, and what role John Gotti had played in arranging the most significant organized crime murder in American history. John made the decision, Sammy testified, his voice steady and matter-of-fact despite the enormous meanings of what he was revealing. He convinced us that Paul had lost touch with what the family was supposed to be about, that he was more interested in his real businesses than in protecting the soldiers who did the real work. And when the federal cases started coming down, John became convinced that Paul might cooperate to save himself. He described the planning sessions, the selection of shooters, the coordination of the operation, and the immediate aftermath when Gotti took control of the family. His testimony provided prosecutors with the kind of insider evidence that would be almost impossible to challenge in court, since he had been present for the most sensitive conversations and had participated directly in the most crucial decisions. But the psychological cost of providing this testimony was enormous. Each session required him to relive violent incidents he had spent years trying to forget, to betray confidences men had shared with him in moments of trust, and to systematically destroy relationships that had defined his adult life. The most difficult sessions were those dealing with murders he had committed personally or had directly ordered. While he had always been able to explain these killings as necessary, business decisions or responses to threats against the organization, describing them to federal prosecutors forced him to confront the human cost of his choices in ways he had always avoided. "I've killed 19 people," he said during one particularly difficult session, his voice barely above a whisper. 19 human beings who had families, who had children, who had lives and dreams and hopes. I told myself for years that it was just business, that it was necessary to protect the family and keep discipline. But sitting here now, having to describe each one of these murders in detail, I can't hide from what I really am. I'm a monster who destroyed lives for money and power. The FBI agents and prosecutors conducting the debriefing were impressed by both the completeness of Sammy's knowledge and the apparent honesty of his testimony. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who tried to minimize their own roles in criminal activities while emphasizing the guilt of others, Sammy was brutally honest about his own actions and motivations. This honesty made his testimony more believable, but it also made it more damaging to himself. By providing detailed accounts of murders he had committed, criminal businesses he had run, and illegal activities he had participated in, he was essentially providing prosecutors with evidence that could be used to convict him of crimes that carried possible death sentences. But the cooperation agreement protected him from such additional charges in exchange for his complete honesty about past activities. The government needed his testimony more than they needed to prosecute him for crimes they might not have been able to prove. Without his cooperation, word of Sammy's cooperation began to circulate within the criminal community. The reaction was quick and predictable. He was called a traitor, and are rat terms that carried enormous shame within a culture that valued loyalty above all other good qualities. Former partners who had considered him a friend and mentor now spoke of him with contempt and hatred. More ominously, his cooperation made him a target for payback by organized crime figures who saw his testimony as a threat to their own security and the stability of their criminal businesses. The witness protection program would provide some security for him and his family, but it could not completely eliminate the risks associated with betraying the secrets of America's most violent criminal organization. John Gotti's reaction to news of his underbosses' cooperation was characteristic of his personality. A mix of rage, disbelief, and wounded pride that his most trusted assistant had betrayed him in the most public and humiliating way possible. "That fat piece of garbage," he was recorded saying during one of his few remaining opportunities to speak privately with family members. 25 years I treated him like a brother. 25 years I made him rich and powerful, and this is how he repays me. He's destroyed everything we built together." But Gotti's anger could not change the reality of his situation. With Sammy's testimony added to the extensive electronic watching evidence and other cooperating witnesses, the government's case had become almost impossible to win through traditional defense strategies. The man who had been known as the Teflon Don was about to face charges that would stick permanently. The stage was set for what would become known as the trial of the century, a legal proceeding that would not only determine the fate of John Gotti and his co-defendants, but would also set examples for how the government would prosecute organized crime cases in the future. At the center of it all would be Sammy Gravano, the most important cooperating witness in the history of American organized crime, whose decision to break the code of omerta would forever change the world of criminal prosecution and criminal defense in cases involving organized crime. The man who had once been one of the most feared figures in the American Mafia was about to become its most terrible enemy. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn was turned into an armed fortress on March 2, 1992, the opening day of what media outlets had called the trial of the century. Sharpshooters placed on surrounding rooftops scanned the crowds of reporters, curiosity seekers, and law enforcement personnel who had gathered to witness what many considered the most significant organized crime prosecution in American history. Inside the courthouse, metal detectors and armed marshals provided additional layers of security for a trial everyone understood carried unprecedented stakes for both the government and organized crime. The defendant was John Gotti, the man who had become the public face of the American Mafia through his expensive suits, confident manner, and remarkable ability to avoid conviction despite decades of criminal activity. Sitting beside him at the defense table were Frank Locascio, who had succeeded, Sammy Gravano as underboss of the Gambino family, and Thomas Gambino, a capo, whose conviction would show that the government's reach extended throughout the organization's order. But the most important figure in the courtroom was not seated at either the prosecution or defense table. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull. Gravano was scheduled to testify as the government's star witness, a man whose cooperation had made this prosecution possible and whose testimony would either prove or destroy the government's case against his former boss and partners. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, who had spent months preparing for what he knew would be the most challenging and significant case of his career. The evidence against Gotti was extensive and damaging, but Gleason understood the trial would finally be won or lost based on the jury's assessment of Sammy Gravano's credibility as a witness. Gleason's opening statement was methodical and complete, laying out for the jury the structure and activities of the Gambino crime family in language that was clear and accessible to ordinary citizens who had no previous knowledge of how organized crime actually worked. Ladies and gentlemen, Gleason began. Over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence about one of the most sophisticated and violent criminal organizations in American history. You will learn how this organization created hundreds of millions of dollars through illegal activities that corrupted real businesses, terrorized honest citizens, and turned violence into a routine business practice. He described the order of the family, the various criminal businesses it ran, and the methods used to keep discipline and secrecy within the organization. But most importantly, he prepared the jury for the testimony they would hear from Salvatore Gravano, explaining why the government had entered into a cooperation agreement with such a high-ranking criminal figure. You will hear testimony from a man who was John Gotti's underboss, his second in command, and one of his closest partners for more than a decade. Gleason explained, "This witness will tell you about crimes he participated in, murders he committed, and illegal activities he helped organize. His testimony will not be pleasant to hear, and you may find yourself questioning why the government has entered into an agreement with such a person." Gleason paused, making eye contact with each member of the jury before continuing, "But you will also learn that this witness has provided information that could only have come from someone at the very heart of this criminal organization. His testimony has been supported by extensive electronic watching, financial records, and testimony from other witnesses. And perhaps most importantly, you will learn that his decision to cooperate came only after he discovered that his loyalty to John Gotti was not returned, that the man he had served faithfully for decades had been privately criticizing and undermining him even while publicly treating him as a trusted partner. The defense strategy developed by Gotti's attorney, Albert Krieger, was to attack the credibility and motivations of the government's cooperating witnesses, while portraying the prosecution as a politically motivated attack on Italian-American culture and traditions. Krieger argued his client was being persecuted rather than prosecuted, targeted by ambitious federal prosecutors, more interested in generating headlines than in pursuing justice. But the center of the defense strategy was a systematic attack on Sammy Gravano's character, motivations, and credibility. Krieger planned to argue Gravano was a pathological liar and manipulative sociopath who had betrayed his closest partners to save himself from well-deserved punishment for his own crimes. The government's case depends entirely on the testimony of a man who has admitted to murdering 19 people. Krieger told the jury during his opening statement, "This is a man who has lied, cheated, and killed throughout his adult life, who has betrayed every trust that was ever placed in him, and who is now trying to save himself from life imprisonment by telling prosecutors whatever they want to hear." The courtroom was packed throughout the trial with reporters, law enforcement officials, and members of the organized crime community, closely following every development in a case that would establish important examples for future prosecutions. The media coverage was extensive and generally favorable to the prosecution, though defense attorneys complained the pre-trial publicity had made it impossible for their clients to receive fair trials. When Sammy Gravano finally took the witness stand on March 2nd, the courtroom fell silent as spectators and participants realized they were witnessing a historic moment. For the first time in the history of American organized crime, an underboss of a major crime family was testifying in detail about the organization's structure, activities, and leadership. Sammy's appearance had changed dramatically since his arrest. Gone were the expensive suits and confident bearing that had marked his years as a powerful crime figure. In their place was a middle-aged man in prison clothes who looked smaller and more open than the feared criminal prosecution witnesses had described in their testimony. But his voice was steady and his manner calm as prosecutor. John Gleason began the direct examination that would make or break the government's case. "Mr. Gravano, what was your position in the Gambino crime family?" Gleason asked. "I was the underboss under John Gotti," Sammy replied, his words carrying clearly throughout the silent courtroom. "Can you explain to the jury what that position involved?" "The underboss is the second highest position in a crime family," Sammy explained matter-of-factly. "I was responsible for overseeing the family's day-to-day operations, settling arguments between different crews, and serving as the main connection between the boss and the capos who managed various criminal businesses." Over the course of 9 days of testimony, Sammy provided the jury with an insider's view of organized crime that was unheard of in its detail and completeness. He described the family's organizational structure, its various criminal businesses, and the methods used to keep discipline and loyalty within the organization. More importantly, he provided specific testimony about John Gotti's role in ordering murders, approving criminal activities, and managing the organization's affairs. His testimony was supported by wiretapped conversations that captured Gotti discussing many of the same criminal activities. Sammy described from personal knowledge. The most dramatic moments in his testimony came when he described the murder of Paul Castellano, providing details about the planning, doing, and aftermath of the most significant organized crime murder in American history. "John told us that Paul had to go," Sammy testified, his voice remaining steady despite the enormous meanings of his words. He said Paul had lost touch with what the family was supposed to be about, and he was worried that Paul might cooperate with the government to avoid spending his life in prison. He described the planning meetings, the selection of shooters, and his own role as a lookout during the actual murder. His testimony provided prosecutors with evidence that directly linked John Gotti to premeditated murder, supported by electronic watching and other supporting evidence. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sammy's testimony was his obvious knowledge of details only someone at the very heart of the organization could have had. He could describe not just what had happened, but why it had happened, how decisions were made, and what considerations influenced the family's leadership in their various criminal activities. The cross-examination by Albert Krieger was aggressive and confrontational, designed to portray Sammy as an unreliable witness, whose testimony was motivated by self-interest rather than a commitment to truth. Mr. Gravano, isn't it true that you're testifying against John Gotti because you want to reduce your own sentence? Krieger demanded. That's one reason, Sammy admitted honestly, but it's not the only reason. What other reasons do you have? I found out that John had been lying to me for years about his feelings toward me and my contributions to the family. The wiretapped conversations showed me he never respected me or valued my loyalty the way I thought he did. Krieger pressed him on his motivations, his criminal history, and his credibility as a witness. But Sammy's responses were consistently straightforward and difficult to challenge. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who tried to minimize their own roles in criminal activities, Sammy was brutally honest about his own actions while providing terrible testimony about Gotti's leadership of the organization. The defense also called several character witnesses who testified about Gotti's reputation in his neighborhood and his real business activities. But these witnesses could not effectively counter the extensive evidence of criminal activity prosecutors had presented. After 6 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury on April 2, 1992. Their discussions lasted only 13 hours before the jury returned with verdicts that would reshape the world of American organized crime. John Gotti was found guilty on all counts, including racketeering, murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Frank Lacasio was also convicted on all charges. The verdicts represented a complete victory for the prosecution and a terrible defeat for organized crime figures who had believed their most successful boss was safe from prosecution. The sentences given several months later showed the seriousness of the crimes and the defendants' leadership positions within the criminal organization. Gotti received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, effectively ending his criminal career and removing him permanently from any role in organized crime leadership. For Sammy Gravano, the successful prosecution represented both proof and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in his life. His cooperation had achieved its intended purpose of bringing down John Gotti and showing the government's ability to get inside and prosecute even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. But it had also made him the most famous rat in the history of organized crime, a status that would follow him for the rest of his life and create ongoing security concerns the witness protection program could only partly address. The trial established important examples for future organized crime prosecutions and showed that the code of omerta was not unbreakable when prosecutors could offer cooperating witnesses enough incentives and protections. It marked the beginning of a new time in the war between law enforcement and organized crime, one in which insider testimony would play an increasingly important role in taking apart criminal organizations. But for the participants, it represented something more personal and more final: the destruction of relationships, loyalties, and ways of life that had supported them through decades of criminal activity. The world that had created both John Gotti and Sammy Gravano was changing in ways none of them had expected, and the future would require changes many would find impossible to make. The Witness Protection Program facility in an undisclosed Location looked nothing like the federal prison where Sammy Gravano had spent the previous 2 years waiting for trial and providing testimony against his former partners. Instead of concrete cells and steel bars, there were comfortable living quarters, recreational facilities, and educational programs designed to help witnesses transition from their previous lives to new identities in the real world. But for Sammy, the physical comfort of his new environment could not ease the psychological complexity of his situation. He had achieved his primary objectives. His testimony had resulted in John Gotti's conviction and life sentence. His own sentence had been reduced to just 5 years in prison, and his family had been provided with new identities and protection from payback by organized crime figures. But he had also destroyed everything that had given meaning to his adult life, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt, and entered a world where his past accomplishments meant nothing and his future chances were uncertain. The Witness Protection Program, operated by the U.S. Marshal Service, was designed to provide new identities and secure relocations for witnesses whose testimony against dangerous criminals made them targets for payback. Participants received new names, new social security numbers, new birth certificates, and new personal histories carefully constructed to hide their previous identities, while providing believable backgrounds for their new lives. For Sammy and his family, this meant becoming completely different people. Salvatore Gravano, underboss of the Gambino crime family, ceased to exist in any official capacity. In his place was Jimmy Moran, a middle-aged businessman from the Midwest who had moved to Arizona to pursue opportunities in the construction industry. His wife, Deborah, became Lavra Moran, and their children received new names and carefully constructed personal histories that would let them attend school and pursue normal lives without fear of discovery. The transformation process was complete and often emotionally difficult. Everything connecting them to their previous lives had to be abandoned or carefully hidden. Family photographs, personal keepsakes, friendships, business relationships, and even habits of speech or behavior that might reveal their true identities to observant strangers. For Deborah and the children, the adjustment was particularly challenging because they had not chosen this new life, but were adapting to it as a result of decisions made by someone else. They had enjoyed the prosperity and status that came with being part of a powerful crime family, but they had also lived with the constant stress and danger such connections involved. The Witness Protection Program offered them safety and the possibility of normal lives, but it required them to give up everything familiar and comfortable about their previous existence. Their new home was in Tempe, Arizona, a middle-class suburban community about as far removed from Brooklyn's organized crime environment as possible. The desert landscape, the casual social atmosphere, and the absence of the ethnic neighborhoods and community loyalties that had defined their previous world represented both freedom and isolation. Sammy's adjustment to real business life was complicated by his lack of regular credentials or experience in legal businesses. While he had run several real businesses during his criminal career, these had primarily served as fronts for illegal activities or money-cleaning operations. His real skill was in criminal business, threats, and violence skills that had little application in the real business world. The Witness Protection Program provided some assistance with job placement and business development, but participants were expected to become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. For someone of Sammy's background and temperament, this meant trying to translate his leadership abilities and business instincts into legal businesses that could create enough income to maintain his family's standard of living. His first real business was a small construction company that specialized in residential, remodeling, and commercial renovation projects. The construction industry was familiar territory for him, though operating within the limits of legal business practices required. significant adjustments in his approach to customer relations, employee management, and competitive practices. Gone were the days when he could solve arguments through threats or eliminate competition through violence. Instead, he had to learn to compete through quality workmanship, competitive pricing, and customer service concepts familiar to him in theory, but challenging to put into practice after decades of relying on criminal methods to achieve business objectives. The real construction business was also much less profitable than the criminal businesses he had run in New York, where his illegal activities had created hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with minimal overhead costs. His real business struggled to create enough profit to support his family's lifestyle, while meeting the regulatory and tax obligations legal businesses faced. More challenging was the social isolation resulting from his inability to discuss his background or previous experiences with new acquaintances and business partners. The witness protection program required participants to keep strict secrecy about their previous identities, which meant developing genuine friendships or close business relationships was extremely difficult. When neighbors or colleagues asked about his background, his family, or his previous business experience, Sammy had to rely on the carefully constructed cover story program officials had developed for him. He was Jimmy Moran from Ohio, who had worked in construction for 20 years before moving to Arizona to pursue new opportunities. His wife was a homemaker, his children were good students, and his life had been thoroughly ordinary and unremarkable. The psychological stress of keeping this deception was enormous. Sammy had spent his entire adult life as someone who commanded respect and fear throughout his community, whose opinion mattered in important decisions, whose reputation opened doors and created opportunities. Now he was nobody special, just another middle-aged businessman struggling to make ends meet in a competitive market where his previous accomplishments meant nothing. The contrast was particularly stark when he watched news coverage of developments in the organized crime world he had abandoned. Former partners were being arrested, tried, and convicted based in part on testimony he had provided. The Gambino family was struggling to keep its operations under increased law enforcement pressure and the loss of experienced leadership. The construction and waste management industries in New York were being transformed by federal investigations that had exposed the criminal cartels he had helped create and manage. From his viewpoint in Arizona, these developments proved his decision to cooperate with prosecutors and confirmed his assessment that the traditional, organized crime model was becoming impossible to continue in the face of modern law enforcement techniques. But they also reminded him daily of the world he had lost, the power he had abandoned, and the relationships he had destroyed. His children's adjustment to their new lives was easier in some ways and more difficult in others. They were young enough to adapt to new schools, new friends, and new social environments without the psychological baggage that affected their parents. But they also had to live with the knowledge that their father was one of the most famous criminals in American history, that their safety depended on keeping false identities, and that they could never return to the places and people they had known during their early childhood. For Deborah, the adjustment was particularly challenging because she had to balance her loyalty to her husband with her concerns about the impact his decisions were having on their children's lives. She had supported his choice to cooperate with prosecutors when the alternative was life imprisonment, but she struggled with the ongoing results of that decision for their family security and social relationships. The Witness Protection Program provided ongoing support and monitoring to make sure participants remained safe and were successfully adapting to their new lives. Program officials kept regular contact with the Gravano family, helped solve problems that arose with their new identities, and monitored possible threats to their security from organized crime figures who might want to pay back against Sammy's testimony. But the program could not solve the basic challenge all participants faced: the need to build meaningful lives based on new identities, while hiding the experiences and relationships that had shaped their previous existence. For someone like Sammy, who had spent 25 years as a major figure in organized crime, this challenge was particularly sharp. By 1995, 3 years after entering the witness protection program, the Gravano family had achieved a measure of stability in their new lives. Sammy's construction business was profitable enough to support their basic needs. The children were doing well in school, and they had developed social relationships within their community that provided some measure of normality. But the limits and deceptions required by their new identities were taking a psychological toll that would finally lead to decisions that endangered everything they had worked to build. The man who had once been one of the most powerful criminals in America was about to discover that escaping his past was much more difficult than he had expected, and that the real world offered challenges and temptations he was not equipped to handle. The next phase of Sammy Gravano's life would show that changing identities was easier than changing character, and that the skills and instincts that had made him successful in organized crime were not easily adapted to real business and social relationships. The call came on a humid evening in July 1997, 5 years after Sammy Gravano had entered the witness protection program and established what appeared to be a successful new life as Jimmy Moran, real businessman and suburban family man in Tempe, Arizona, but the voice on the other end of the line belonged to someone from his previous world, someone who had tracked him down. Despite all the precautions and security measures supposed to protect cooperating witnesses from contact with their former partners. "Hello, Sammy," the voice said, using his real name rather than the identity he had been living under for half a decade. "We need to talk." According to later court testimony, the caller was a former Gambino family associate who had managed to avoid prosecution during the wave of arrests that followed Sammy's cooperation. This individual had relocated to Phoenix and was running what appeared to be legitimate businesses while maintaining connections to organized crime figures throughout the Southwest. For Sammy, the contact represented both a threat and an opportunity. On one hand, Papa's ability to locate him showed his new identity was not as secure as he had believed, raising concerns about his family's safety and the effectiveness of the witness protection program. On the other hand, the call offered him a chance to reconnect with the world he had abandoned, to reclaim some measure of the respect and excitement missing from his real business activities. "What do you want?" Sammy asked carefully, knowing his phone might be monitored by federal agents responsible for his security. "I want to meet," Papa replied. "There are opportunities here that might interest you." "Legitimate opportunities," he added, though the emphasis he placed on the word suggested otherwise. Against his better judgment and in violation of witness protection program rules, Sammy agreed to the meeting. It took place at a restaurant in Scottsdale in a back booth where they could speak privately while keeping the appearance of a casual business lunch between real businessmen. What Papa proposed was entry into Arizona's rapidly growing club and bar scene, particularly places that catered to young adults interested in the emerging rave culture. Sweeping through major city areas throughout the country, the business appeared legitimate on the surface. Nightclubs, restaurants, and entertainment places that served legal customers and created income through regular means. But Papa hinted at additional opportunities less regular and more profitable. The rave scene was attracting young people interested in chemical enhancements to their nightlife experiences, creating demand for substances not available through traditional channels. Someone with the right connections and business skill could, develop very profitable businesses serving this market while keeping the appearance of running real entertainment businesses. The kids coming to these clubs have money, and they want to have good times, Papa explained. We can give them places where they can party safely, and we can provide additional services that make their experiences better. It's a perfect business model. High profit margins, loyal customers, and minimal law enforcement attention because everything looks legitimate on the surface. For Sammy, the proposal was attractive for reasons going beyond simple financial considerations. His construction business was successful enough to support his family, but it was boring, routine, and offered none of the excitement or respect that had characterized his previous criminal career. Managing construction crews and bidding on remodeling projects was a far cry from the complex criminal businesses that had once created millions of dollars while commanding respect. Throughout the criminal underworld, more importantly, the real business world offered limited opportunities for someone with his background and temperament. He was intelligent, ambitious, and accustomed to operating at high levels of authority and responsibility. But his lack of regular credentials and his inability to discuss his previous business experience honestly made it difficult for him to pursue opportunities matching his capabilities and aspirations. The club business offered a chance to operate in an environment more compatible with his personality and skills. Entertainment places needed the kind of leadership abilities, people management skills, and strategic thinking that had made him successful in organized crime. They also operated in a regulatory gray area, allowing for creative interpretations of laws and regulations, something appealing to his business instincts. Against the explicit warnings of witness protection program officials, Sammy began developing business relationships with Papa and other figures involved in Arizona's emerging nightlife scene. He invested money from his construction business profits into a partnership that bought several nightclubs and restaurants throughout the Phoenix area. The businesses were structured to appear completely legitimate. All necessary licenses and permits were obtained through proper channels. Employees were paid through regular payroll systems, and taxes were filed on time and in full. But beneath this surface of legitimacy, the clubs became centers for activities less regular and more profitable. The key was understanding the culture and preferences of the young adults who frequented these places. Rave culture was built around all-night dance parties, electronic music, and chemical substances that made the sensory experiences associated with loud music and flashing lights better. The most popular of these substances was MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, which created feelings of happiness, increased energy, and enhanced sensory perception without the aggressive or violent side effects associated with other illegal drugs. Ecstasy was particularly well suited to the club environment because it made users more social, more affectionate, and more interested in dancing and music rather than fighting or causing problems. Users were generally peaceful, friendly, and focused on having positive experiences rather than creating the kinds of disturbances attracting law enforcement attention to other types of illegal drug operations. For Sammy, the ecstasy trade represented an opportunity to apply his criminal business skills to a market both highly profitable and relatively low risk compared to traditional organized crime activities. The customer base was wealthy, willing to pay high prices for quality products, and unlikely to cooperate with law enforcement, even if arrested for drug-related offenses. The supply chain was also more manageable than traditional drug trafficking operations. Ecstasy was made in sophisticated laboratories, typically located in European countries, where the chemical ingredients were more readily available. The finished product was compact, odorless, and easy to transport, making international smuggling operations much simpler and those needed for bulkier drugs like marijuana or cocaine. Most importantly, from Sammy's viewpoint, the ecstasy trade operated in a legal and cultural gray area, providing some protection from aggressive law enforcement attention. Many police officers and prosecutors were unfamiliar with rave culture and MDMA, viewing them as less serious threats than traditional drug trafficking operations involving heroin, cocaine, or crack cocaine. This perception let Sammy's organization operate with relatively little interference from law enforcement agencies, focusing their resources on what they considered more serious drug problems. The clubs provided perfect cover for distribution operations. Since the presence of young people, obviously under the influence of chemical substances, could be explained as alcohol intoxication or the natural effects of loud music and physical exertion from dancing. By 1999, Sammy's Arizona operation had grown into a sophisticated criminal business, creating millions of dollars a year while keeping the appearance of real business activity. The organization included several nightclubs and restaurants, a network of distributors supplying ecstasy to customers throughout the Southwest, and connections to international suppliers providing high-quality MDMA at wholesale prices. The operation was structured using many of the same organizational principles, making his previous criminal businesses successful. Authority and responsibility were clearly defined, with different individuals handling specific parts of the business to minimize the risk. Any single person's arrest or cooperation could compromise the entire organization. Financial records were carefully managed to separate real business income from illegal drug profits, and money-cleaning operations made sure criminal proceeds could be changed into apparently legal property. But perhaps most importantly, Sammy applied the same strategic thinking and risk management techniques characterizing his work with the Gambino family. He understood successful criminal businesses needed careful attention to law enforcement patterns, community relations, and internal security measures protecting the organization from both external threats and internal betrayal. The success of the operation let Sammy reclaim some measure of the lifestyle and respect he had enjoyed during his years as a powerful organized crime figure. He drove expensive cars, wore costly jewelry, and lived in a mansion reflecting his newfound prosperity. More importantly, he was once again a person of importance within his community, someone whose opinions mattered and whose approval was sought by others. Involved in criminal businesses. But the return to criminal activity also brought back the stresses and dangers characterizing his previous life. Operating outside the law needed constant watchfulness against law enforcement listening, careful management of criminal partners who might betray the organization for their own benefit, and ongoing concerns about violent competitors who might try to push into profitable area. The Witness Protection Program officials responsible for monitoring Sammy's activities began to notice changes in his behavior and lifestyle, suggesting he might be involved in illegal activities. His construction business, while still operating, was no longer his primary focus. His social circle had expanded to include individuals with known criminal backgrounds, and his spending patterns were inconsistent with the income his real businesses could reasonably create. More troubling were intelligence reports suggesting Sammy Gravano, the cooperating witness whose testimony had helped. Convict John Gotti was being discussed and wiretapped. Conversations between organized crime figures monitoring his activities with interest. If his new identity had been discovered, it raised serious questions about his security and his family's safety. The federal agents assigned to his case began conducting their own watching of his activities, using many of the same techniques employed against him during his years with the Gambino family. What they discovered was evidence. of a criminal organization remarkably similar in structure and sophistication to the businesses he had run in New York, adapted to different criminal markets and geographic conditions, but following essentially the same business model. The investigation that followed was complete and methodical, reflecting the lessons law enforcement agencies had learned from their previous experiences with Sammy's criminal businesses. Instead of focusing on individual transactions or specific criminal acts, investigators sought to document the entire structure and operation of his organization using RICO laws and other tools developed specifically for prosecuting complex criminal businesses. The evidence they put together was extensive and damaging. Wiretapped conversations captured Sammy discussing drug transactions, money cleaning operations, and other criminal activities in his own voice. Financial records traced the flow of money between his real businesses and his illegal businesses. Watching photographs documented meetings with known drug dealers and other criminal figures. Perhaps most damaging of all was testimony from several of his own partners arrested on related charges, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. These cooperating witnesses provided insider accounts of how the organization worked, what role Sammy played in its management, and how criminal proceeds were created and given out. The parallels to his previous prosecution were striking and deeply ironic. Once again, Sammy found himself facing RICO charges based on extensive electronic listening and testimony from cooperating witnesses. Once again, he was confronted with evidence appearing overwhelming and difficult to challenge through traditional defense strategies. And once again, he was forced to consider whether cooperation with prosecutors might be his best option for avoiding life imprisonment. But this time, his situation was complicated by his previous cooperation agreement and his status as a protected witness. The government that had once relied on his testimony to convict John Gotti was now prosecuting him for violations of the agreement, providing him with a reduced sentence and new identity. The irony was not lost on federal prosecutors, finding themselves in the unusual position of prosecuting their own star witness for criminal activities engaged in while supposedly living as a law-abiding citizen under government protection. The arrests came in February 2000, as coordinated raids swept through Arizona and several other states, targeting Sammy and dozens of his partners in what authorities described as one of the largest ecstasy distribution operations ever uncovered in the United States. The scale of the operation was staggering. Investigators estimated the organization had distributed more than 25,000 ecstasy pills, with a street value of several $1 million over a period of approximately 3 years. For Sammy, the arrest represented the collapse of everything he had worked to build since leaving the witness protection program. His real businesses would likely be taken as proceeds of criminal activity. His family would once again face the uncertainty and danger associated with his criminal prosecutions. And his reputation as a cooperating witness would make him a target for violence from criminal partners. Viewing his previous betrayal of John Gotti as evidence he could not be trusted to keep loyalty under pressure. But perhaps most significantly, the arrest showed that despite all his efforts to reinvent himself as a real businessman, he had been unable to escape the criminal instincts and methods defining his adult life. The skills making him successful in organized crime had finally led him back into criminal activity, proving that changing identities was much easier than changing character. As he sat in a federal detention facility, waiting for trial on charges that could result in decades of imprisonment, Sammy had to confront the reality his decision to cooperate against John Gotti had not provided the new beginning he had hoped for. Instead, it had merely postponed a reckoning with the final results of a lifetime devoted to criminal business. The most famous cooperating witness in the history of organized crime was about to become a defendant once again, facing prosecution by the same federal system that had once protected and rewarded his cooperation. The wheel had come full circle, and the man who had betrayed the Gambino family to save himself was about to learn that salvation through betrayal was at best a temporary delay from the certain results of a life devoted to crime. The federal courthouse in Phoenix was a study in contrasts on the morning of October 2, 2002, as Sammy Gravano appeared for sentencing on charges related to his operation of what federal prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking organizations ever uncovered in Arizona. Gone was the confident manner and expensive clothing characterizing his previous court appearances. In their place was a 57-year-old man in prison clothes who looked older than his years, worn down by the accumulated weight of a lifetime of criminal activity and its results. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members who had come to witness the final chapter in one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history. Sammy Gravano, the underboss who had brought down John Gotti, the cooperating witness whose testimony had revolutionized organized crime prosecution, and the protected witness who had returned to criminal activity despite having been given a new life by the federal government, was about to learn his fate. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming and almost impossible to defend. Wiretapped conversations captured Sammy discussing drug transactions and money cleaning operations in detail. Financial records traced millions of dollars in criminal proceeds through his various businesses. Dozens of witnesses, including several of his own partners, had testified about his role in managing a criminal organization, distributing thousands of ecstasy pills throughout the Southwest. Perhaps most damaging of all was the evidence, showing his criminal activities had begun almost immediately after entering the Witness Protection Program, suggesting his cooperation with federal prosecutors had been motivated more by self-preservation than by any genuine commitment to abandoning his criminal lifestyle. His defense attorney had argued Sammy was a man unable to escape the criminal culture shaping his entire adult life that his return to illegal activities was the result of psychological and social pressures making real life impossible for someone with his background. But the argument carried little weight with prosecutors and judges, viewing his criminal activities as a betrayal of the trust placed in him when given a second chance through the Witness Protection Program. District Judge Aline Ross, who presided over the sentencing, had reviewed extensive materials about Sammy's criminal history, his cooperation with federal prosecutors, and his subsequent return to criminal activity. Her comments during the sentencing hearing reflected both her understanding of his complex history and her judgment about what justice required in his particular case. "Mr. Gravano," she began, looking directly at him as he stood before the bench, "you have lived an extraordinary life, though not one anyone should want to copy. You rose to the highest levels of organized crime in America, participating in 19 murders and countless other violent crimes terrorizing honest citizens and corrupting real businesses." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "When you were facing life imprisonment for those crimes, the government offered you an opportunity few criminals ever receive, the chance to cooperate, to tell the truth about your activities, and to begin a new life under federal protection. Your testimony was valuable to law enforcement and helped convict some of the most dangerous criminals in America." The judge's tone became more stern as she addressed his subsequent criminal activities. "But instead of using that opportunity to become a productive member of society, you chose to return to criminal activity almost immediately after entering the Witness Protection Program. You organized and managed a sophisticated drug trafficking operation, creating millions of dollars in illegal profits while corrupting young people and contributing to the drug problems plaguing our communities. Judge Ross sentenced Sammy to 20 years in federal prison, a term keeping him locked up until he was nearly 80 years old. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of his drug trafficking activities and his violation of the cooperation agreement, providing him with a reduced sentence for his previous crimes. But perhaps more significantly, the sentence represented a final judgment on a life defined by choices between real opportunities and criminal businesses, between loyalty and betrayal, between redemption and returning to crime. At every crucial decision point, Sammy had chosen the path leading deeper into criminal activity, even when alternatives were available, possibly leading to real success and social acceptance. His family members present at the sentencing appeared destroyed by the outcome, understanding they would once again face years of uncertainty, financial hardship, and social shame associated with their relationship to one of America's most notorious criminals. His children, now adults, had spent most of their lives dealing with the results of their father's criminal activities and the fame coming with being related to such a controversial figure. Deborah, his wife of more than 30 years, had stood by him through his rise and fall in organized crime. His decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors, their years in witness protection, and now his return to criminal activity and imprisonment. Her loyalty had been tested in ways few marriages ever experience, and the toll was clear in her appearance and manner as she watched her husband being sentenced to what might amount to the rest of his productive life in federal prison. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive and generally critical of Sammy's choices and character. Editorial writers and commentators noted the irony of a man given unprecedented opportunities for redemption choosing instead to return to the criminal activities defining his previous existence. His case was cited as evidence some criminals were simply incapable of rehabilitation, regardless of the incentives and assistance provided to them. But within law enforcement circles, Sammy's case was viewed as a warning tale about the limits of cooperation agreements and witness protection programs. His return to criminal activity raised questions about the government's ability to successfully change high-level criminals and the wisdom of providing reduced sentences to defendants whose commitment to real lifestyles was questionable. The case also highlighted the ongoing challenges faced by law enforcement agencies in their efforts to fight sophisticated criminal businesses. Despite decades of successful prosecutions and the cooperation of numerous high-level witnesses, organized crime continued to adapt and evolve, finding new opportunities in changing social and money conditions. Sammy's drug trafficking operation had shown the same organizational skills and strategic thinking making criminals successful in traditional businesses could be applied effectively to new markets and new opportunities. The techniques developed during his years with the Gambino family, careful planning, disciplined management, strategic use of violence and threats, had translated successfully to the very different world of club-based drug distribution. As he was led away to begin serving his sentence, Sammy appeared to understand this was likely the final chapter in his criminal career. At 57 years old, facing 20 years in prison, he would be nearly 80 when released, assuming he lived long enough to serve his full sentence. The likelihood he would have opportunities to return to criminal activity after his release was minimal, both because of his advanced age and because of the intense law enforcement attention following him for the rest of his life. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his final sentencing was what it revealed about the man himself. Throughout his criminal career, Sammy had shown remarkable intelligence, strategic thinking, and leadership abilities that could have been directed into real businesses if he had made different choices. His success in both traditional organized crime and drug trafficking showed he possessed skills, valued in both criminal and real contexts. The tragedy of his life was not that he lacked alternatives to criminal activity, but that he consistently chose criminal businesses over real opportunities, even when the risks and results of such choices became increasingly severe. His case showed criminal behavior was often not a result of limited options or desperate circumstances, but of personal choices made by individuals finding criminal businesses more attractive than real alternatives. From his prison cell in a federal correctional facility in Colorado, Sammy began serving a sentence likely lasting until the end of his productive life. The man, once one of the most powerful criminals in America, whose testimony had brought down John Gotti and revolutionized organized crime prosecution, had become simply another aging inmate in the federal prison system. But his story serves as both a warning tale about the results of choosing criminal businesses over real opportunities and a case study in the complexities of criminal rehabilitation and cooperation agreements. It shows providing criminals with second chances does not guarantee they will take advantage of those opportunities, and that some individuals may be basically unsuited for real lifestyles, regardless of the incentives provided to encourage such transitions. But it also illustrates the remarkable adaptability and resilience characterizing both criminal organizations and the individuals creating and managing them. Despite decades of law enforcement efforts, multiple prosecutions, and the cooperation of numerous witnesses, organized crime continues to find new opportunities and new methods for creating illegal profits while adapting to changing social and legal conditions. The legacy of Sammy the Bull Gravano is thus complex and contradictory. He was at the same time one of the most successful criminals of his generation and one of law enforcement's most valuable cooperating witnesses. He was a man who betrayed his closest partners to save himself from life imprisonment, and then betrayed the government protecting him by returning to the criminal activities defining his previous existence. His story is finally a tragedy of wasted potential and repeated bad choices, a demonstration of how intelligence, leadership ability, and business skills can be directed into businesses, destroying rather than building, corrupting rather than contributing, and finally leading to the destruction of everyone involved, including the criminals themselves. On September 18, 2017, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano walked out of federal prison after serving 17 and a half years of his 20-year sentence. He was 72 years old, his health diminished by years of incarceration, but he remained a survivor in a world where most of his former associates were either dead or forgotten. By 2023, at age 78, Sammy had found an unlikely new career, living openly in Arizona under his real name. He hosted a popular podcast called Our Thing, discussing his notorious past with millions of listeners. The man who had once been the most feared cooperating witness in American history was now a media personality, sharing stories of a world that had largely vanished. His health had declined significantly during his imprisonment. His family relationships had been strained by decades of criminal activity and its results, and the world he had once dominated had moved on without him. The organized crime world creating and supporting him no longer existed in any recognizable form. The Gambino family, once the most powerful criminal organization in America, had been destroyed by prosecutions following the example set by his own cooperation. The construction and waste management industries creating enormous illegal profits were now subject to intensive government oversight, making traditional organized crime methods useless. Most of his former partners were dead, imprisoned, or living in obscurity, their criminal careers ended by the same law enforcement techniques. His cooperation had helped perfect. John Gotti had died in federal prison in 2002. His reputation as the Dapper Don replaced by the reality of a man who died alone and forgotten behind bars. The neighborhoods in Brooklyn where Sammy grew up and built his criminal empire were now gentrified. Communities where young professionals paid enormous rents to live in apartments once housing immigrant families and aspiring criminals. The social clubs and restaurants where he conducted business were now trendy places, serving artisanal coffee and organic meals to customers with no knowledge of the violent history once unfolding in those locations. His children had grown up and built their own lives, trying to distance themselves from the fame coming with being related to one of America's most famous criminals. They had real careers, families of their own, and little contact with the man whose choices shaped their childhoods and continued to influence their adult lives. His relationship with Deborah remained complicated. While sources differ on the exact status of their marriage during and after his imprisonment, the decades of criminal activity, cooperation with prosecutors, and repeated betrayals had taken an irreparable toll. She sought to build a quieter life away from the constant scrutiny that had followed their family for years. The witness protection program, once providing Sammy with a new identity and fresh start, had been reformed partly in response to his case, with stricter oversight and more complete monitoring of participants designed to prevent the kind of return to criminal activity characterizing his experience in Arizona. Federal prosecutors now used his case as a warning tale when negotiating cooperation agreements with other high-level criminals, pointing to his example as evidence. Cooperation motivated purely by self-interest was likely to be temporary and unreliable. His case had influenced changes in how cooperation agreements were structured and monitored, with greater emphasis on demonstrating genuine commitment to real lifestyles rather than simply providing valuable testimony. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Sammy Gravano's life was what it revealed about the nature of criminal businesses and the individuals creating and managing them. His story showed organized crime was not simply a product of poverty, limited opportunities, or social disadvantage, but often the result of choices made by intelligent, ambitious individuals finding criminal businesses more attractive than real alternatives. His rise through the ranks of the Gambino family showed how criminal organizations worked as businesses with rational decision-making processes, strategic planning, and sophisticated management techniques remarkably effective in creating profits and keeping organizational discipline. His cooperation with federal prosecutors revealed the internal workings of these organizations in unprecedented detail, providing insights revolutionizing law enforcement's understanding of how to investigate and prosecute complex criminal businesses. His return to criminal activity after entering witness protection showed the limits of rehabilitation efforts and the difficulty of changing individuals whose entire adult identities had been built around criminal businesses. His case suggested some criminals might be basically unsuited for real lifestyles, regardless of the incentives and assistance provided to encourage such transitions. As he sat in his prison cell, reflecting on a life encompassing extraordinary success and spectacular failure, remarkable loyalty and ultimate betrayal, enormous wealth and complete loss, Sammy understood his story would be remembered as both a warning tale and a case study in the complexities of criminal justice and human nature. He had achieved things most criminals could only dream of, rising to the second highest position in America's most powerful crime family, creating millions of dollars in illegal profits, commanding respect and fear throughout the criminal underworld, but he had also paid prices few people could imagine. The loss of family relationships, the destruction of his reputation and legacy, and the sacrifice of his freedom and future to the results of his criminal choices. His testimony against John Gotti had been described as the most significant cooperation in the history of organized crime prosecution, helping convict one of America's most notorious crime bosses and establishing examples, influencing law enforcement strategies for decades. But that same testimony also made him one of the most hated figures in the criminal underworld, a rat whose betrayal of the Code of Omerta violated everything organized crime supposedly stood for. His return to criminal activity in Arizona showed his cooperation with federal prosecutors had been motivated more by self-preservation than by any genuine commitment to real lifestyles, weakening his credibility and reputation while providing ammunition for critics, arguing cooperation agreements with high-level criminals were basically flawed. The final accounting of Sammy Gravano's life reveals a man of remarkable abilities who consistently chose paths leading to destruction rather than construction, corruption rather than contribution, and finally to the loss of everything possibly giving his existence meaning and value. His story is a tragedy, not because he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but because he was an intelligent, capable individual with alternatives to criminal activity who chose crime anyway. In the end, the most important lesson of his life may be that criminal businesses, no matter how sophisticated or profitable, finally consume everyone involved in them, the criminals themselves, their families, their partners, and the communities in which they operate. The temporary rewards of criminal activity are inevitably outweighed by the permanent results of choosing to live outside the law, to build wealth and power through violence and corruption, and to prioritize immediate satisfaction over long-term consequences. Sammy the Bull Gravano had been one of the most successful criminals of his generation, but his success had been built on foundations never providing lasting satisfaction or security. In losing everything that mattered to him, his family, his freedom, his reputation, and his future, he had paid the ultimate price for a life devoted to businesses, promising much but delivering only destruction in the end. His story serves as a final reminder that in the criminal world, as in all worlds, there are no true winners, only survivors and victims. And sometimes, as in Sammy's case, the same person manages to be both. This concludes the complete story of Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, from his humble beginnings in Brooklyn to his rise as underboss of the Gambino crime family, his historic betrayal of John Gotti, his failed attempt at a real life in witness protection, his return to crime in Arizona, and his final imprisonment. The story captures the full arc of one of the most significant figures in American organized crime history, a man whose choices changed not only his own life but the entire world of criminal prosecution. In the United States, by 2017, after serving 17 and a half years, Sammy Gravano was released from federal prison. Today, at age 78, he lives as a free man in Arizona, hosting his own podcast and sharing his stories with a new generation. His journey from the underboss of the Gambino family to the most famous cooperating witness in history remains a defining chapter in the world of American crime. What did you think of Sammy's story? What part surprised you the most? And what other deep dive crime stories would you like to explore? Let me know in the comments below. And do not forget to sign up for more complete true crime content going beyond the headlines to explore the complex human stories behind America's most notorious criminals.